pretend he's set up.
We're ready to begin, Your Worship.
All right, then let's do it. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Township of Georgian Bay Planning Council meeting for Tuesday, March 4th, 2025, and I'd like to call this meeting to order at 9 a.m. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we wish to acknowledge the enduring relationships between Indigenous peoples and the lands that they have traditionally occupied. We recognize and deeply appreciate the connection they have to this place, the land, the water, the sky, and all that live in, on, and above it. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this place and who continue to care for this place. And we want to show our respect. Hundreds of years after the first treaties were signed, they remain relevant today. May they guide our decisions and our actions. We commit to learn, to educate, to honor sacred places, and to take action towards real truth and reconciliation. Miigwech. Council, any declarations of pecuniary interest or conflict of interest? All right, seeing none, we're going to go into any open forum, by the way, Clerk Way.
No, Your Worship.
All right, thank you. Then we're going to go straight into the Municipal Act public meetings portion of our meeting. And so this morning, there is a public meeting scheduled for one Shore Road closing application. I will briefly summarize the procedure to be utilized for the meeting. First, the clerk will advise council as to when, how, and to whom notice of the public meeting was circulated for the proposed road closing being considered. Next, staff will advise of the purpose and effect of the bylaws and provide for any other information that is relevant to the applications, and staff will summarize any correspondence on file. From there, the public will have an opportunity to speak and provide comments to the bylaw being considered. Please be respectful of time and be concise with your comments. All commentators are requested to state their name and address. Council will then have an opportunity to provide comments for clarification. I now declare this meeting to be a public meeting pursuant to the Municipal Act, of 2001 C25, as amended, to deal with the following proposed Shore Road closing bylaw. R24-12, road allowance for 818 Haskett Drive. To our clerk.
Notice of the public meeting was digitally published in a virtual newspaper and was sent to the abutting neighbors in close proximity to the property at least 30 days to today's meeting.
Thank you. And to our staff who are presenting this report, please.
Through you. Sorry. I can't see both. Through you, Mayor, the presentation of the shore allowance application for Scott and Christian Rogers of 818 Haskett Drive, application number R24-12. There were 7 written correspondences. Judy Kirk and Dennis Carter of 842 Haskett Drive in support of the application. Vince and Jenny Lou Santoro of 862 Haskett Drive object to the application. Rob and Tracy Stewart of 852 and 856 Haskett Drive in support of the application. Mr. and Mrs. Fisher of 812 Haskett Drive in support of the application. John Kirk of 832 Haskett Drive objects to the application. Robert Sampson who is the new owner of lots 9 and 10 of 832 Haskett Drive, objects to the application, and Amanda Brennan of Miller Thompson, lawyer for John Kirk, requests a deferral in order to find a resolution to the right-of-way access. The applicants have requested the partial road allowance to protect the current privacy buffer. Sorry, I'm trying to do both at the same time here. The road allowance has been requested for the current privacy buffer. The road allowance for Part 1 is 253.683 square meters at a cost of $8 per square meter, equaling $2,029.46 plus HST. The location map shows the subject lands, which is partial road allowance for purchase at this time. The top portion of the road allowance, shown in red, is currently the subject of a drainage issue, and until such time a resolution is completed, this portion will not be eligible for purchase. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm trying to do both at the same time here. Shown in red there is not available for purchase. However, the one in blue is the one that is the subject lands being purchased for today. I'd like to point out that the road allowance that is being the access is not part of the road allowance being purchased. It is on the side. That right of way on the lot provides an easement access for lots 11 to 13. However, lots 9 and 10 do not have a registered easement. The aerial image shows the subject lands of 818 Haskett Drive, and the final slide shows a plan of survey. Comments received express concerns for access to the road and other lots. As you can see on the map, the road is not part of the road allowance that is being purchased and has no bearing on the sale of the road as per legal counsel.
I'm not hearing anything at this point.
Neither are we.
Yeah, that's the end of the presentation.
Okay, I wasn't sure because I thought I saw our clerk's mouth moving. I didn't know whether she was speaking to something or not, but I apologize. All right, so the presentation is over. So then are there any members of the public who wish to comment on this application?
There is one person present in the room, Your Worship. They're stepping up to the mic, and there's one person remote who's raised their hand.
Okay. And to be reminded, those who are speaking, if they would please identify themselves, including their name and address, and I'm asking to keep each of them to keep their comments brief, please. In other words, to the point.
Mr. Sampson, you're remote. Okay. Mr. Sampson is joining as a panelist. If you would like to speak.
We'll go to Mr. Sampson and then the in-person guest.
Yes, please.
Okay, Mr. Sampson.
Morning, everybody. How you doing? This is Rob Sampson. I live at 494 Berwick Road on 6 Mile Lake. I was made aware of this application late last week. I am currently under contract to purchase lines 9 and 10 at 832 Haskett Road. I'm requesting a deferment, basically so I can determine if purchasing this road allowance would essentially negate any ability to gain access to my property. It's my understanding that there's been a dispute for some time between several of the lot owners over there regarding the easement of the current driveway that I believe's been there since about 1974. That has not come to a resolution, and then this application came up, which I believe, if approved, could essentially negate my any future ability to build a road to have access to those properties. So essentially asking for deferment so I can speak to the adjoining properties and the neighbors, figure out if any resolution could be done regarding the current easement of the driveway, or review title on this property to figure out if that would essentially negate ability to add a driveway, or if I would still be able to access the properties by purchasing road allowance and building a new driveway. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Does any staff member wish to respond to that at this point, or we're going to wait for counselors to ask about it?
Through you, Mayor, after consulting with our legal counsel, that is not the case. They ensure that it is not going to negate the access to that access right of way.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to make a request now, and we may get to it later, but just for preparation, if somebody's able to indicate to us, to council, where Mr. Sampson's property is located relative to this application, that would be appreciated. But with that, we will go to our in chambers guest, please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Scott Rogers. I'm the owner of 818 Hasketts. Thank you for hearing my request. My application was submitted after the Stewart's successful road closure that happened in the fall of 2024. And when that happened, it's important to note that the Stewart's property would be the other half of the amount of the road that I am requesting. Why it is important for those that have visited my property. This location, you can see clearly the back of my cottage, so it is for privacy issues. And there is no planning building. I built our cottage probably about 7 or 8 years ago, so there's no reason to expand at this point. As many of you are aware, you can look at the structure and kind of wonder why the lines are drawn where they are, and it is in kind of consultation with the township. I do plan eventually, which I do think will take some time, once as the water drainage issues at the north end of the property with various lots is hopefully resolved. At that time, I will request to purchase what abuts, and property lines would be a lot more clear and I think linear at that time. In regards to the easement issue, there's a lot of history here, and I'm just learning now about Mr. Sampson's conditional offer, so that is news to me. But in 2015, through township on this road, township did pass easements for specific roads in 2015. At that time, John elected to pass on that. I do think, or Mr. Kirk, I do think over the last little while he's been looking at the potential for sale, and he has approached me. And we were midst of negotiations on that. I also had an interest, and the last offer that was provided, I was expecting to hear I had one question for John on the issue, and I was waiting to hear back. He mentioned April, so this is news to me. But in terms of the request that is at hand, I do think, you know, from my own perspective, precedence has been set from the stewards, and it is strategic, and I don't have any building that I'm planning on doing on that. I don't know if anyone has any questions for me.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to now confirm with our clerk that we have no other members of the public online or in person who would like to speak.
That is correct. No one else is here.
All right, well then I'm going to turn it over to council, but Messrs. Rogers and Sampson, there may be questions for you from council. I'd appreciate if you respond to them if that's the case. And we're going to start with Councilor Graziano, please.
Thank you, and through your worship, being the ward councillor for 6 Mile Lake and also being a resident on 6 Mile Lake, I'm quite familiar with some of the issues here that have arisen. To summarize, and I'm going to articulate my reasons for summarizing, but I do agree with the deferral request, and the reason for this is because ultimately there's a precedent already previously set. This matter or a similar matter, specifically the stewards, as was articulated by Mr. Rogers, had previously come before council, and there was some contentious issues around the purchase of this road access. We afforded them a deferral for all parties to come together and collectively discuss this, with it returning back to council, I believe, a month or two thereafter, at which point we passed this. I would agree in the deferral in that it would echo a past approach. It seems like there are some issues here that need to be ironed out amongst the neighbors. I understand that the abutting neighbor does not approve of this. I believe it's one of our tests, based on our bylaw in order to allow for the purchase today. So I'm hoping that perhaps council in its wisdom would echo what I'm suggesting here and allow the parties to collectively come together. As Mr. Rogers had articulated now, he was unaware that there was a purchase, and as such, perhaps he can have a dialogue there. There are some concerns. One, of course, is that there is a road, and in selling this, there could be some impacts to the accessibility to other properties downstream. We've heard our clerk today articulate that upon legal review, it was advised that this may not impact, but unfortunately that legal review was not part of our package, and I have no information as to what the lawyer had advised and what context he would respond or she responded to. So I'd very much like to see that if this matter is deferred and returns back to council, because I'd like to better understand what our lawyer had articulated and why they feel that this would not have any impacts. There is also, of course, what I did see was the alternative perspective, which was a legal review from, I believe, Miller & Miller, if I'm citing their name correctly, and it seems that they are concerned. So, of course, lawyers are always there to present their clients' perspectives, and but I'd like to understand our lawyer's perspective as well and position. So with that said, I just don't have perfect information, and knowing the potential impacts that this may have on not only the applicant but also downstream residences, I would recommend that we defer. So that's my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. CEO Mariotti, do you wish to respond?
Thank you, Mayor Coetzee. Just very briefly with respect to our lawyer's advice, it was circulated to council, excuse me, I think on Friday, and so council should have it in their email.
Thank you. Councilor Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor. And I just have a question or a couple of questions related to this application for our clerk and deputy clerk, and that is, I think in the interest of transparency and awareness, it would be helpful to understand and maybe enter into the records and the minutes, the rationale in the letters of support and the rationale in the letters of objection. I heard there were sort of 2 or 3 letters of each, but I think it would be helpful if the actual rationale was there to be considered by the public. I realize that the letters may be available, but I think it would be helpful to summarize that in your minutes related to this application. That's my only suggestion. Thank you.
Through you, Mayor, to Councillor Cooper, the ones in support did not have a rationale, and the ones that were objecting were due to the access right of way and due to the drainage issue, which is at the top of the property.
Sorry, Mayor, if I just may then say that, without some sort of reasoning behind and rationale behind a support or objection, I think it holds way less weight than if you have reasoning and rationale for your position. Thank you.
Thank you. I did see Councillor Jarvis at one point.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to my hand. It was up.
Well, then I'll go Councillor Jarvis, followed by Councillor Predko, please.
Thank you. A couple points for clarification. Can we go back to slide 4? There was that one other piece of the property that you had in red, and I think I missed what the status of that was. I think it's slide 4. So 2 questions with regards to that slide. The part in blue, it's only half of that's being applied for purchase. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And then the red, the part you've highlighted in red, part of that is parallel to Mr. Rogers' property. Would he be eligible to purchase that, or has that already been purchased?
The part in red is the drainage issue portion, so it won't be eligible for purchase until that has been resolved.
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you. One last question then. I see that the right-of-way is not, the current right-of-way to lots, to the owner's lot, to lots 9 and 10, is not even part of this application.
That's correct.
And that it's a right-of-way access, so from a legal standpoint, that stays for our owner, who's Mr. Sampson, who's proposing to buy lots 9 and 10. He'd still have that access, correct?
He would still have the access in that it is not a registered easement. For Judy Kirk, who is just down below at the very bottom, she has a right of way, and it is an easement, a registered easement. So lots 11 to 13 have a registered easement, whereas 9 and 10 do not.
Okay.
Sorry, just Your Worship, if I may interject just to provide some context. In June of 2015, a consent application came to the Committee of Adjustment for the registered easement over lots 8 and 9 and 10 and 11. So collectively, the road, that Haskett Drive road that runs down starting on lot 8, that could then travels down over 9 and 10 and into lot 11, and then was approved. And so lots 9 through 13 were actually approved over top of lot 8 through the easement. However, due to unknown reasons, because that was a decade ago, the easements for lots 9 and 10 right over lot 8 was not registered, but all of the other easements were registered. So that's why lot 11 has the registered easement over lot 8 and 9 and 10, but lots 9 and 10 do not have the registered easement on title over lot 8, even though it was approved in July of 2015. All the other ones got registered accordingly, and the decision was to approve all of them, but for whatever reason, the registration didn't go through for those 2 lots on title.
So do we need to clarify that for the proposed owner of lots 9 and 10? What needs to happen for this owner, Mr. Sampson, to have clear access to his lots?
Ms. McCabe could speak to the easement process.
If I may, in order to legalize these access easements, they will have to apply to the Committee of Adjustment again and have those two easements created and legally registered on title.
And the purchase of this block has nothing to do with that, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Predko, please.
Thank you, and through your worship, this overall application, I understand the issues behind it, and I think I'm satisfied with the understanding that the easement and the drainage issues are really not impacting the sale of this piece of road allowance. My only concern is the conditional offer on lots 9 and 10, and the information being new to Mr. Sampson and having to make a decision on purchasing this property. In that regard, I would support a deferral, but otherwise, I'm really fairly comfortable with this process. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bochek, please.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor Coates here. Similar to my companions next to me, I don't really have an issue with the purchase of the road allowance, providing all the little things are taken care of. And the one thing that I am not sure of is the drainage problem at the end of this, because as far as I recollect, when you have a drainage problem, that has to go somewhere. It just doesn't stop at where you're looking to end the purchase. And I don't think we've been given any direction on whether this drainage is going to go underneath this road, down the side of it, but eventually it has to get to the lake. So until I have a plan of drainage and what comes out of that, I really don't feel safe making a decision on this. I will move for a deferral until I get the information I need. And if the planning department can offer me anything to do with the future of the drainage, let me know. But if I don't have it, then I'm going to wait to get it.
Thank you. Councillor Graziano.
Thank you, Worship. I wasn't sure whether or not you wanted to speak on the matter first before I went next. Yes, and just to confirm, CAO Mariotti was accurate. I do see the legal letter here. Unfortunately, in my review, I didn't know who Sheila was, and in the initial correspondence, it didn't make mention that our lawyer had responded, so I didn't want to assume that was our lawyer. But that said, our lawyer does say it could reduce the number of options available to that property for gaining access. And I'd like to explore that a little bit deeper. And I think that's the root of the concerns that I have right now, is that I'd like to have the residents try to negotiate a favorable position collectively amongst themselves before we get involved. But with that said, it does seem like our lawyer, according to his correspondence, which is Joshua Matson, does state that this could reduce the available options to any future property owners from gaining access. So these are concerns. Of course, I think that prudence suggests that we wait, allow for that dialogue to occur, after which, if it does return back to council and no movement has been brought forward, then perhaps we can render a decision. So just my thoughts, and I did want to confirm that, yes, in fact, CAO Mariotti was correct that the 28th of February I did receive this correspondence in combination with all the other correspondences. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I'm looking at this and I'm trying to understand it. I appreciate the concerns raised, and I get a little confused about the names, and then unfortunately we got lot numbers, and then we also have addresses. But having said that, if I understand the survey that I'm looking at correctly, the lane that is providing access to the cottages that are, shall we say, past those of Mr. Rogers does not pass over the property in question right now, the road allowance that goes beside it, and therefore whether or not this road allowance is sold to Mr. Rogers, to the best of my knowledge, would have zero effect on the ability of Mr. Sampson to obtain a easement over Mr. Rogers' property. And so we're not, there are, from what I can tell, the road allowance that is proposed to be transferred to Mr. Rogers does not have any passageway going across it, road, lane, or what have you. If you could confirm that, that'd be one question.
That is correct, sir.
Thank you. The second, the second thoughts are around the drainage issue, and my understanding is that the drainage challenge is not, I'll call it north of this particular piece. I recognize the comment of Councillor Bocek that the solution may involve this piece of land, but if I understand the Drainage Act correctly, when the final solution is when they come up with the final solution, it'll include drainage going over pieces of property that are owned either by the township or by the individual landowners. And so in a sense, if this particular piece of property being considered right now ends up being part of the solution, that means that the cost of that portion of the solution will bear on Mr. Rogers versus the township. So if Mr. Rogers is willing to take that risk, that's up to him. I mean, to me, that shouldn't be a deciding factor for us in that, you know, if the drainage ends up going through what is called part one on this draft, on this survey I'm looking at, the transfer piece in question, then I would say that that's up to him if he wants to take on that potential risk, if he wants to acquire it. So to me, the two concerns that I've heard about this transfer in my mind shouldn't really be concerns. That with regards to this transfer, that they are independent of this transfer. So I find myself having I don't find for me a reason to defer this application. Council, any second round comments? I will then locate the motion and read it.
Point of order, Your Honor.
Certainly.
I would like to move for a deferral.
Okay.
I'll second that.
All right. So we have a motion by Councillor Bocek, seconded by Councillor Graziano to defer this application. Ms. Way, could you make sure we follow proper procedure in how we handle this?
Certainly, apologies. Certainly, Your Worship, if you could call the vote on the deferral first.
Okay.
We haven't read the other motions, so the deferral stands first.
All right, Council.
Point of order, if I may, Your Worship. I'd also like a registered vote on the deferral, as well as a registered vote on if the deferral fails. Thank you. So 2 registered votes. Thank you.
All right. So the motion in front of council now is all those in favor of a deferral. Ms. Clerk, can you please take the vote?
Councillor Graziano, how do you vote?
Yes, to a deferral. Thank you.
Councillor Jarvis, how do you vote?
No.
Councillor Pretko, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councillor Bocek, how do you vote?
Yes.
Councillor Cooper, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mayor Kutsier, how do you vote?
No.
Let the record show the motion's carried 4-2.
All right, so this motion is deferred. Do we need to record the reasons, or do you already have that from the discussion?
It'll be captured in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. And with that,
Point of order, if I may.
Councilor Graziano.
I wanted to respectfully excuse myself now and attend to my family. So thank you, council, and I'll be watching live. Thank you.
Thank you. So that ends the Municipal Act public meeting portion of our meeting. And we're now going to go into a Planning Act public meeting. This morning, there is a public meeting scheduled for one proposed zoning bylaw amendment. I will briefly summarize the procedure to be utilized for the meeting. First, the clerk will advise council as to when, how, and to whom notice of the public meeting was circulated for the proposed amendments being considered. The clerk will also advise of the appeal procedure. Next, staff will advise of the purpose and effect of the bylaws and provide any other information that is relevant to the application, and the clerk will summarize any correspondence on file. From there, the public will have an opportunity to provide comments on the amendments being considered. Please be respectful of time and be concise with your comments. All commentators are requested to state their name and address and sign in on the sheet provided if you are in person. After the public discussion, the public meeting will be closed. Council will then have an opportunity to provide comments for clarification. I now declare this meeting to be a public meeting pursuant to Section 34 of the Planning Act to deal with the following proposed amendments. Zoning bylaw amendment file number Z24-14 for 227 for Huron Trail. To our clerk.
Notice of the public meeting was sent by first-class mail to the respective owners and assessed persons within 120 to 800 meters of the property subject to the proposed applications, and to those persons and agencies likely to have an interest in the applications. These notices were sent at least 30 days prior to this morning's meeting. Included in each notice was an explanation of the purpose and effect of the proposed applications and a key map showing the location of the properties or description of the lands to be affected by the proposed amendments. Other relevant information may have also been provided. These circulations were all provided in accordance with the provisions of the Planning Act and the Township of Georgian Bay Official Plan. Members of the public are advised at this point that unless they make an oral or written submission to council before council makes a decision on these applications, then any subsequent appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal may be dismissed by the tribunal. Anyone who wishes to be notified of council's decision respecting the proposed zoning bylaw amendments must submit written request to the planning department.
Thank you very much. Is there any correspondence on file, Madam Clerk?
Yes. Correspondence relating to zoning bylaw amendment file Z24-14 was received as follows. One letter was received from the District of Muskoka stating district staff are unable to recommend approval of the above noted application due to outstanding technical supporting documentation. Two letters were received from Kelly Nicholson, Chief Billing Official, and Jasvinder Radigan, Director of Financial Services and Treasurer, stating they have no concerns regarding the application. One letter of support was received from Reverend David W. Opham.
All right, thank you very much. Ms. Wanfor, you're the municipal planner, I believe, on this file, and I'll turn it over to you to provide an overview of the application and where we're at to date. Thank you.
Through the mayor. The subject property has an area of 10,400 square meters with approximately 90 meters of frontage onto 6 Mile Lake. A detached dwelling and accessory pickleball court occupy the land. The property is forested with mature trees except for a clearing around the dwelling and driveway. The lands are designated waterfront within the district and township official plans and are zoned 6 Mile Lake residential, exception 1. The purpose and effect of the proposed zoning bylaw amendment is to amend the zoning bylaw to facilitate the construction of a dock having an increased length of 16.2 meters, whereas 10 meters is permitted, within a type 1 fish habitat zone, whereas a 5-meter setback is required from this zone.
Exactly. If you're a U.S. resident, you have to file a U.S. tax return regardless.
A provincial planning.
Excuse me, we're hearing voices in the background. somebody's mic on? Thank you.
Through the mayor. The provincial planning statement provides policy direction on matters of provincial interest related to land use planning and development. The policy states that development and site alteration shall not be permitted in fish habitat except in accordance with the provincial and federal requirements. Provincial and federal requirements means legislation and policies administered by the federal or provincial governments for the purpose of fisheries protection, including fish and fish habitat. Fisheries and Oceans Canada, or DFO, is a department of the Government of Canada that is responsible for developing and implementing policies and programs in support of Canada's economic, ecological, and scientific interests in oceans and inland waters. The lands are located within a deer wintering area known as Stratum 2, partially within an extreme wildfire hazard rating area, and are identified as having moderate to high archaeological potential. Development or site alteration in Stratum 2 deer habitat should conserve valuable conifer thermal cover, feeding areas, and movement corridors. In accordance with the official plan, development shall generally be directed to areas outside of lands that are unsafe for development due to the presence of hazardous forest types for wildland fire, as defined in the PPS as forest types assessed as being associated with the risk of high to extreme wildland fire using risk assessment tools established by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources as amended from time to time. The district and township may request an assessment be undertaken by a professional where development is proposed and areas identified as extreme, high, and needs evaluation. District and township staff did not require an assessment for the dock. Type 1 fish habitats require the highest level of protection because of their specific sensitivity and importance to local fish populations. A fish habitat assessment undertaken by a qualified professional at the appropriate time of year and using recognized protocols shall generally be required for development within or adjacent to Type 1 habitat. The lands are designated waterfront within the 6 Mile Lake Inland Waterfront Community. The plan states, in general, the size of shoreline structures should not exceed a maximum width of 15% of the lot frontage and a maximum projection into the water of 10 meters. Variances to general standards for the size and location of shoreline structures should only be considered where it is not possible to meet the requirement, for example, increased length into the water to accommodate shallow water. Note that the applicant has informed staff the increased dock length is required to achieve a water depth of 3 feet or 0.91 meters for a small boat. The plan also states for new development, a 15-meter setback is required from warm water fish habitat. Reduced setbacks may be considered where it has been demonstrated through the submission of an impact assessment that there will be no negative impact on the habitat. Subject lands are zoned 6 Mile Lake Residential Exception 1 within the Township zoning bylaw, which permits a detached dwelling and accessory uses thereto. The exception requires a minimum front yard of 30 meters. Docks are limited to a width of 3.1 meters and a maximum length or projection of 10 meters. The proposed dock has a width of 3.05 meters and a length of 16.2 meters. The minimum required setback from a fish habitat type 1 zone shall be 5 meters. Tarandis Associates Limited has prepared a fish habitat impact assessment in support of the proposal. Since October of last year, the assessment has been revised by Tarandis to reflect comments received from the township's environmental consultants, Hutchinson Environmental Sciences Limited, or HESL. Both environmentalists agree that the dock is not likely to cause impacts to the surrounding fish habitat. HESL upholds that a review by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is required. In most recent correspondence, HESL are requesting more detailed construction mitigation measures. Staff anticipate Tarandis will provide this information prior to staff forming a recommendation report for council at a subsequent meeting. The public meeting is only for the purposes of conveying information and gathering comments. The planning analysis and evaluation report with recommendations shall be presented to council at a future meeting after comments are addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if the applicant wishes to make any comments or presentation.
Yes, we are just bringing the applicant and his agent over.
All right, thank you.
The applicant, Mr. Belcheck, and the agent, Mr. Spelling, are both on the screen, Your Worship.
All right.
Hello.
Mr. Belbeck.
Hi. Let me know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
That's great. Thank you. First of all, it's David Belbeck. My wife and I have owned the property at 227 Huron Trail since about 1991. And I want to thank council for taking time to consider our application for a dock. We initiated the application last fall. We have tried our best to follow all of the process necessary. I think we are pleased that both the primary environmental review and the peer review have come to agreement that the dock that we plan to implement, which is a pile construction and will have minimal contact with the floor of the lake, will not have any impact on the fish habitat. We share others' view that we have a beautiful treed property. We would like to be able to enjoy the property with a dock, but want to do so in a way that has minimal or no impact on the environment. We, through the process, came to a point where it was requested that DFO review also be initiated, and we're happy to do that. We don't know what the timing will take, but we're happy to do that to make sure that we've followed the process completely. The other thing I would say is we have engaged a local and reputable dock builder, Taylor Docks, who understands the lake well and can help us to make sure that both the construction design itself and the process satisfy all environmental requirements. We have a kayak and a canoe we'd like to dock rather than sort of impacting the shoreline. And as Shania mentioned, it may be that in the future we would have a small boat. As many of our neighbors have, it seems that there is limited boating in the bay, but that none of that boating has had a negative impact on the beauty and the natural environment that exists. So I would be happy to take any questions from councillors. I also have made available to the meeting Don Speller of Torrandis Environmental, who can provide environmental information as required by council as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Speller, do you wish to make any additional remarks at this point? You're muted, sir.
Sorry, my microphone was turned off.
Yeah.
Yes, I'd be quite happy to provide a few additional comments that might be helpful.
All right. Well, shall we wait for council questions then, and or do you want to make some remarks?
I'm happy to take questions now. Sure.
Whatever you prefer.
Let's go for questions.
Okay. Councillor Bochek's had his hand up for a bit, so we're going to go to him first, please.
Thank you, Mayor Coetsier. And Mike, I did miss the first half of the presentation, so I apologize for that. Perhaps this has already been answered. To Shania of our planning department, my concern in reading this report last night was the pictorial that showed the neighbor's dock projecting into the sight line of the lot line, as we've been told in the past that the lines continue from shore onto the water and keep in the same direction. So from what I've seen on the pictorial that was sent to us, that lot line crosses right over the neighbor's dock. Perhaps you can just enlighten me on if I'm seeing something wrong or...
Through the mayor, the lot fabrics through the township's or district's GeoHub are not very accurate. And I did review the neighboring property to the east, I believe is what you are referring to. They do have a permit for that dock.
Okay, so I guess my follow-up to that would be, are we putting ourselves in any sort of position to have legal action down the road? Because if council approves this and we find out that that lot line does extend through that dock, we're talking about maybe a mistake by the GeoHub, or maybe this or maybe that. It just doesn't give me the confidence that says if we approve this, we're not going to have legal issues down the road because of this. So I would like to, I don't know if it needs to be surveyed or what needs to be done, but if those lot lines do carry on off of shore onto the water, this shows it goes right through that dock. Thank you.
Council Bocek, I don't think that's the dock that's asking for approval. It's the one to the left, if you will, or the west that
Yes,
we're
yes,
questioning.
I understand that the proposed dock would be to the left of it, but the one to the right of it, the neighbor's dock, it looks like this lot line extends right through that neighbor's dock.
Good. To our planners.
Through the mayor, I could look at the neighboring property's building permit file. Typically, considering that that neighboring property, the dwelling looks relatively new, it is likely that they have a survey on file to verify the lot boundaries. However, that dock is not subject to this application.
If I may, one more follow-up, Mr. Mayor.
Go ahead.
Through the process of notification, was the neighbor notified, and did we receive any comments back from that neighbor objecting to this?
Through the mayor, if the clerk could go over the correspondence, that would be greatly appreciated.
Through your worship, there was only one letter received from Reverend David Opham. I don't have his address offhand.
So there was no objection to this application, is what I'm saying.
Correct, there was no objection received.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor. And I just have a question about the actual proposed dock. I think I heard that essentially it's a pole dock or something to that effect. In other words, there's pylons running down. And I'm just curious, you know, fish don't really know the exact border of fish habitat and non-fish habitat. And so, you know, I think they might even stray occasionally. I know they won't get in trouble, but I suspect they'll stray down the shoreline a little bit. So it is pretty close to an important fish habitat. And I'm curious as to why a pole dock as opposed to a floating dock, because a floating dock does not have anything to do with the bottom of the lake bottom. And one would think it would be less intrusive, especially for the fishies. Anyway, that's my question. Thank you.
Councillor Cooper. I think I may be able to help you there. The deck of the dock certainly does have something to do with the bottom of the lake, and it's connected to the bottom by these pilings. And I think there are a dozen or maybe 15 of these pilings, but they occupy exactly 1.6 square feet of the lake bottom. So it's very small. The computer screen that you may be looking at is probably in that size range. And the dock deck itself is going to be a positive amenity to fish habitat in that it provides shade.
If I may,
Please.
So you're talking about each single pylon, but in total, and I'm not talking about the square footage of the foot of the pylon, but in effect, there's a lot of pylons going down to the bottom under this dock. And I don't think you really answered my question, is why isn't this a floating dock would be less obtrusive to the environment?
Floating dock would require anchors, which would also occupy some of the lake bed.
I understand that Miss Nicholson has put her hand up. A little birdie told me.
Thank you, Mayor. And I was just going to actually reiterate what Mr. was speaking of. So it is actually true that most floating docks do have very heavy, large cement anchors that hold the end of the dock. So in most cases, the print, like Mr. Speller was speaking of the posts cover less area. And it is an actual popular approval or application of a dock in cases of that because it's not required for approval through MNR or DFO because of the size limitation.
Comment if I may.
Please.
Yes, I have three over 40, 3 docks that are 40 feet each or more, and do have anchors. They're way out from where the dock is located, so even further out into the water in order to stabilize the dock in 2 directions. And I'm just saying, under the floating docks, generally speaking, my experience has been that there are lots of fish there. But if you have all sorts of poles going down, it may be more obstructive. That's all I'm trying to point out. To have people consider floating docks probably less obtrusive, at least for the fish. Thank you.
Thank you. I did see Councillor Predko's hand at one point.
Thank you, Mayor, but my concerns were actually with the dock next door, and I think our planner allied my concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I see Director Whitlow, and then I'm going to go to him, and then I'm going to go to the applicant, and then I'm going to go to Councillor Jarvis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. If it would assist Planning Council, the EIS review that went through several iterations back and forth between the parties, the applicant's consultant and the township's peer reviewer expressed no preference on the design of the dock. Nothing turned on the design of the dock, whether it was floating or not, and the EIS concluded that the dock itself, its presence would have no impact.
Thank you. To the applicant, Mr. Belbeck.
Yes, hi. I just in response to the councilor's question, I just wanted to say that we chose pile construction because we were advised that it would have the least environmental impact, and I'm relying on professionals for that. But also a floating dock, if we needed to take it out each year, would require sort of shoreline disruption, which I don't want to do. We have a beautiful treed lot. I want to keep the treed lot and the treed shoreline as much as possible, and simply have enough room to install the width of the dock. So our decisions have been based on what we believe to be actually the least impactful on.
Thank you. Councillor Jarvis.
Thank you, through the mayor. I have no concerns with this dock per se. I think everything that's been suggested so far is in line. I'm sure fish would actually enjoy having that coverage and maybe some obstacles to fish around. I gather quite often that old cribs have to be left in place quite often because of fish habitat. So I don't have any issue there. My issue, and an issue that was dealt with a few years ago with an application by Mr. Moreau, I think is a similar vein, and that is as addressed by our by Hutchison, is propeller wash. Is the effect of the dock with boats having access to the shallower water. You can't avoid that one way or the other. If the dock's there, the boats will move into shore as closely as they can, and then you get the disruption of the lake bed from propeller wash, among other things. Canoes, kayaks, obviously not an issue, but propeller wash is a significant issue, and I think we need to address that. I think that, and the fact that I don't think it's been clearly identified what type of fish habitat we're dealing with here yet anyway, or have I missed something? Because it looks to me from the Hutchison stuff that there's still some issue over whether this is fish habitat 1 or 2. Did I miss some correspondence?
Through their mayor, there was some initial disagreement between the two environmentalists in terms of whether the habitat was type 1 or type 2. However, staff believe based on M&R data that it is type 1 and will conduct an analysis based on type 1 habitat.
Yeah, because I think there was concerns, obviously, from the District of Muskoka with regards to the lack of final answers to the Hutchison report. I think we need to have that in place before we follow up on it. But my concern definitely is propeller wash, not the dock just by itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bochek.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor Coates, I have a question for Dawn, if I may. You stated that this had a number of pilings. I think you said 12 or 14 pilings. And further to Councillor Cooper's questioning, do each of these pilings have feet on them, or are they simply like a 2-inch pole that goes down to the lake bottom? Oh, your mic's not on, sir.
These pylons to which I referred, they are aluminum. They're 5 inches in diameter, and they go down to and into the lake bed. They are pushed. They are pushed in until they're refused.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Mr. Belbeck, do you have an additional comment? Or is that the hand from last time? All right.
Sorry. No, my mistake. Sorry, I just wanted to clear up any potential confusion. I think Mr. Speller indicated that the pilings take up less than 1.5 square feet, and I believe that to be in aggregate, not each piling. So the total footprint is actually quite small.
Thank you. All right, seeing no more comments at this point, it's time for us to go to the motion. And I have moved by Councillor Predko, seconded by Councillor Cooper. Be it resolved that council directs staff to prepare a recommendation report and bylaw for council's consideration at a subsequent meeting. All those in favor? And that is carried. Thank you. So this concludes the Planning Act public meeting portion of the agenda. All comments, questions, and concerns raised at the public meeting have been recorded and will be taken into consideration by staff prior to a recommendation being brought forward. And so I'm closing this public meeting at 10:02 a.m. And council, I'm going to request, I know it's a little bit early, but let's to have a 10-minute bio break before we go into the staff portion of this meeting, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Speller and Mr. Belbeck.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Are we about ready to get back at it? I apologize for my delay. I just had the doctor's office on the phone. Are we ready to roll? Okay, I see a thumbs up. I couldn't hear your voice. All right, so next on our agenda is a staff report on housekeeping from our planning department, and I believe that this means that we're going to hear from Ms. Wanfor and Mr. Kratky. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mayor, councilors, everyone in attendance here today in person and online. Shania Wanfor and Jeff Kratky, myself, are planners of the Township of Georgian Bay, and we are responsible for the housekeeping zoning bylaw amendment project, but certainly the entire planning department have participated. And today we're here to enlist your participation actively in this document. And so our presentation is going to be a little bit different than normal, and the mayor and the clerk are aware of this and they understand and appreciate it. We're going to provide a number of stops in our presentation where you can ask questions on the part of the material that we've covered thus far. And again, while we're going to be showing slides where we attempt to anticipate things that you might wish to talk about, Shania will have available at all times the actual text. And if there's a particular section or subsection that you want to deal with or discuss, please, when we're in that general vicinity, let us know and we will move to the actual text on the screen so that we can discuss it. I think the other important difference between our presentation, typically we try and cover everything that's in our reports, and in this case, we're not. We have a lot of ground to cover with the actual proposed draft housekeeping amendment,
And so we're not going to be discussing the project plan unless council asks us to, and we're not going to be discussing things like the future zoning bylaw review and update. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Shania.
So some of the more noticeable changes were required to achieve compliance with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. In the zoning bylaw consolidation published earlier this year, staff were able to make the font 12-point Verdana and create a clickable table of contents. Through this housekeeping, staff ensured that zoning bylaw contained properly structured headings or sections, properly formatted tables, consistent paragraph spaces and indents, a consistent numbering format, tables with alternative text, and we also removed all uppercase text where it was not an abbreviation, as well as italics. In our current zoning bylaw, the words provision, regulation, and requirement are used interchangeably. To be consistent, staff are replacing reference to provision and regulation to requirement. This revision will be completely implemented for the draft housekeeping bylaw presented at the open house.
Thank you, Shania. And to begin with, we're here for the first time to show you a notion, an idea of the type of zoning maps that we might move to with housekeeping. The current maps are no longer available to the township to amend with any ease or frequency. The layers, for some reason, are unable to be found, and we did contact the consultants who prepared them. They no longer have them either. The townships worked for some time with the District of Muskoka to keep GeoHub as up to date as possible. During this housekeeping exercise project, we've been working with the district staff to update errors that we were finding in GeoHub. And our hope right now is that GeoHub is the most correct zoning mapping for the township of Georgian Bay. That being said, we are recommending that there still be maps actually attached to the zoning bylaw. And what we're looking at right now is essentially a map book that would be created out of GeoHub, where each of the existing maps would be reproduced, but with the appearance of GeoHub. So you'll see on the right-hand side the same map as currently in our zoning bylaw on the left-hand side, where the colors that you would find in GeoHub are there. And so we're not necessarily satisfied yet with the legend, etc., that's below it, but that's where we're hoping to move, subject to our discussion today with you. In the next slide, we've also found, unfortunately, some errors in our search in correcting things in the actual bylaws. We've also found that Oak Bay was an overly complex set of site-specific exceptions to site-specific exceptions. And the bylaw never actually contemplated that. And so what we are proposing are some actual map amendments to those properties that either were mistakenly miszoned, overlooked, and or in the case of Oak Bay, need to be amended in such a way on the mapping that they then conform with the new text we're proposing. And next, we are also looking to clarify in section 3 what our zoning bylaw is intending to do from the start. And in section 3 is essentially the way in which the zoning bylaw introduces all of the zones within the municipality. And up until now, it has overlooked some very important zones that we have that you saw in that slide along both the Port Severn waterfront and up the Trent Severn waterway, where there are actually lots of record that extend underwater. And so we've proposed an amendment to section 3 that allows those lots to be fully recognized in the zoning bylaw. So up until now, we've had them on the maps,
but we didn't have them in section 3. On the next slide in section 3, we've also tried to clarify where the water's edge and the lot boundaries truly are. And while most of the bylaw was very clear that the high water mark, whether you're on Georgian Bay or on any other inland lake, the high water mark was the boundary between the terrestrial zones on the land and the zones that applied to either the lake bed or to the water. We do have some EP zones that go into both areas. And what we've done is we've proposed amendments to section 3 that we believe make this clear. And we're just going to take a brief pause here to see if there are any questions, either about the maps or about section 3. Councillor Cooper.
I think Councillor Bochek actually snuck his hand up just before me, so we should really honor that, I think, if you don't mind.
And thank you. And I guess we should go through the mayor, through Mayor Coates here.
Just if I can interrupt, can we make this a more formal situation, especially because unfortunately I'm not able to be in present. So I'm going to trust everyone to conduct themselves responsibly, but with the screen up, if you could just consider this almost like a committee of a whole relaxed environment or something, please.
Thank you.
Good luck with that, sir.
Yeah.
Hey, we got to try.
My question is one that comes from a little bit of knowledge, living on the Trent Severn Waterway for a number of years. And yes, a lot of the properties do go underneath the water. But my question is on commercial properties, where I have a commercial property and I lease the water lot that is under there. It is not owned by me, but I lease it. Has this been taken into consideration in this report at all? Or is it something that we need to concern ourselves with because it's only about half a dozen lots? Well, maybe a little more than that.
So through the mayor, the bylaw itself is only concerned with the zoning. So the land ownership rights that fall to you and to any leaser have never been controlled by the zoning bylaw, other than what those lands, how those lands may be used. So this has no impact on legal agreements between parties, and we're not proposing to change any of those zones. So that where on the Trent Severn there is for example, shoreline residential 1 zone that goes underwater. That is not changing. We're simply recognizing that it exists in section 3. So it previously existed. Section 3 simply didn't explain that.
Okay, and my other question is, our bodies of water, especially on the Trent Severn Waterway, are adjacent to Severn Township lots and Muskoka Lake lots when you get up on the Trent Severn Waterway. And a constant problem that we've had is different rules on the same body of water. In other words, neighbor A is allowed to do this and that and this and that, but neighbor B, who's just a few doors down, cannot do anything because of the limitations of that particular township. My question to you is, in all this, did we look at our neighboring townships and see how they address this and see if this kind of works together with what they're doing? Or down the road, are we going to end up with members of the public having real issue with this? And it could be because I don't understand the report because I'm not a planner and it's pretty detailed.
No, Councillor Bochek, that's an excellent question. And no, because as a planner, we would consider that more part of a zoning bylaw review and update. And so while that's not something that's currently on that preliminary list of zoning bylaw review topics, I think obviously that's something we'll have to consider adding to that preliminary list. Because again, the housekeeping bylaw is not meant to go into that kind of exercise of changing potentially the zoning bylaw. We're trying to clarify it.
Thank you. Just a few comments and questions. You referenced the inability to access certain materials, and you checked with a consultant, and they didn't have them.
What were the materials again exactly?
So they're called shape files, and I am not a GIS expert. Geographic Information Systems came along long after I was in school. I
Right.
think the one of us that is most versed with them is Andrew. That being said, very strong efforts were made by our summer student, Philippe, to recover those files. And in the end, we were unable to find those files. He did recover the original PDF versions of those files, and I believe there was some attempt made to translate those into shape files. But again, there would be, for the district to recreate the shape files in the way in which they appeared in the zoning maps in 2014 and in the consolidation of 2021, for the district to do it or for staff internally at the township to do it, it would require significant investment in money and or time to recreate those shape files. So those shape files are no longer available from MHBC, and they have not been found at the township.
Thank you for that. And I just, having been involved in not only the introduction of the new zoning bylaw, now 10 years old, not very new, but anyway, and also a review of some of the mapping in advance and after. There were a lot of, I'll call them paper files. You're talking about electronic files, I think. I'm talking about paper files. And as I understand it, some of those paper files, if you are looking for doing some cleanup, so to speak, would be with the consultant that had all those paper files, and they left the office. They went to the consultant's office in Barrie. So just FYI, that you might find the files at that location.
So the paper equivalents, the PDF versions, the Acrobat versions were recovered by Philippe. Unfortunately, again, those are not what is necessary in today's world to actually produce maps. And so we have the originals. The clerk now has those on file in file hold. But again, those don't allow us to move forward in a way that someone can use a geographic information system to keep them up to date. And so what we're proposing is GeoHub, we now believe, is accurate. Unfortunately, there's probably an error lurking out there that we haven't found. And certainly as we find them, we will bring them to council's attention and correct them. But the notion is that the GeoHub system, although an online version would remain user at risk, we would export at the time that a public meeting is held before your council, we would export a set of maps from GeoHub that would be physically attached to the bylaw that would be the housekeeping replacement of 2014-75 as amended, and then would go into the clerk's book and would be a legitimate hard copy. But at the same time, it would allow us then, through the future review and update of the zoning bylaw and official plan, to rely on the district, who are doing this for a very reasonable cost of, I believe it was $60 an hour for one of their staff person's time. It would allow us to rely upon that on an ongoing basis to keep the zoning bylaw current and up to date, so that if someone were to request access to the current zoning bylaw, we could provide it.
And all fair enough, and I understand that most of what we see on GeoHub is accurate, but some of it isn't, and Councillor Jarvis and myself and Councillor Hazelton and planner Beth Hallpenny went through Honey Harbor, Cognisheen, Go Home Bay, Wawatasi, and identified properties that had been initially in 2014-75 identified as being shoreline residential, and they weren't. In fact, they were open space and or natural state, and all those changes were submitted to the planner consultant in Barrie, and you've retrieved those files, which tells me this information that we provided should be somewhere. And if you don't have that, that's disturbing, and I can tell you probably don't, because when I look at the changes we recommended, some of them were not put through.
So no, that's a separate matter. So what we have recovered from an online source was the original maps that were attached to bylaw 2014-75 as of its date of enactment in 2014 November. Those are the maps we've recovered. So if there was input provided by any person, councillor, group subsequent to that, no, that has not been provided to us by MHBC, and it is not something that we've come across in our files, and we've done a fairly extensive bit of research in consolidating the zoning bylaw and now proposing an update to it.
So let's
if
finish
you
this
have-
off.
If you have something,
I don't
please-
have it, but MHBC does have those, and that would have been in probably 2017, 18, 19, somewhere in there. The files probably are there, the hard copy files of where the changes were recommended, and they were really correcting what was already submitted prior to the approval of 2014-75. So I just want to make you aware that that information is potentially in Barrie.
Okay, and that's new information too. So for example, if 2014-75, well, not if, when 2014-75 was enacted, the maps that were attached to it, even if quote unquote even if they had errors, which were identified afterwards, they became fact. So because 2014-75 repealed 9119, which had been the previous comprehensive zoning bylaw, that zoning bylaw's force and effect was null and void when 2014-75 was enacted.
Yeah.
So if there were errors that you feel are important for us to consider during housekeeping, or perhaps during a separate housekeeping exercise at a later date, we would need to re-examine those and bring those back to council. So for example, we've identified a list of 12 mapping matters to go with this housekeeping amendment. So besides replacing the overall look and feel of the maps, there would be actual 12 amendments to various properties on those maps. If there are another, I don't know, 30, 40, 100, that would be an actual amendment to 2014-75 that would need to be considered by council at some point. That's a separate matter. So again, if 2014-75, the day it was enacted, had errors, those errors became law.
I understand.
Okay.
I understand they became law, but that wasn't the material that was submitted for that resolution. In other words, you made a statement that, they had just enacted what they had. No, they didn't. They actually made changes that caused these errors. So and we came along in 2017 or 18 and said, there's a problem here. There were several of us that went through and looked at them and said, wait a minute, we already did this once. Now we did it a second time. I'll come and do it a third time with you if you'd like. I'd really like to see that we make the effort to ensure that we don't have to do it a fourth time.
Well, there were, as my colleague Shania pointed out, there were some amendment files that we came across in 2017 and 2018 for housekeeping. But we didn't see your actual correspondence or maps.
Can we take this offline? Because I think Councillor Cooper is raising a very valid point, but I don't think talking about it for another 15 minutes adds or decreases from that validity. But I do think it's worthy of staff to follow up.
So do I, and I think I'd be happy to follow up too one more time. I'm just telling you that I really don't want to do it a fourth time. But moving on from some other questions I had for you. So that was sort of the material from the consultant, but you talked about the underwater area. Have you had any feedback from the district in terms of LiDAR mapping for the underwater. And the reason I asked that question, and it may also be something that can be done as housekeeping, is ensuring that we give some consideration to water depth, because certainly the Great Lakes, unlike the inland lakes, which may flood a little bit in the spring or a lot in the spring, but they even out what happens generally. But what happens in Georgian Bay is the climate predicts or creates water levels that are high, the high water mark, but also very low, which could impede access to properties. And if you can't get to a property, you can't pump out a septic system, you can't get materials, or if there's a fire, the fireboat can't get there. I think there's a housekeeping matter around low water and high water. So that's something I'd ask you to think about. The second part of it, though, is that I think there's a difference between the high water mark, which is really, I've pointed this out before, a Great Lakes term, because the high water mark, as I said, is sort of 7 years up, 7 years down. It goes on for 150 years, and there's records of that. Sometimes the stretches are longer and shorter, but they're not an annual thing. It's not where the flooding from the watershed comes along and makes a 6 Mile Lake. Well, actually it's controlled, but some of the lakes are not controlled. So the water would go up and down, but I don't know that that's a high water mark. I think there needs to be a distinction between the high water mark on Georgian Bay and the Great Lakes as opposed to flooding in the spring. So I would ask you to give some thought to that. And the final thing is, at the beginning of your report, you talk about public consultation on April the 4th. I think that's good and admirable. I think we need to make sure that we send an invitation out to all the communities to partake in that. And I would also suggest that it's still early in the season where a lot of people are not paying attention. And we may have to do a second public consulting, so I'd ask you to think about that as well, so that we are asking questions in the season versus not in season. And April the 4th is really not in season for 80% of our residents. Thank you.
So I'm going to answer those in reverse order very quickly, I think. So certainly while we're proposing April 4th, if council feels strongly that that is too soon or early, we can adjust that. The reason we proposed April 4th is that it returns us to the project plan path where the public meeting would happen in May, and then the bylaw might take effect by June. Next, high water mark. So we didn't change the definition of high water mark. The definition of high water mark in the zoning bylaw now and in the proposed housekeeping means the location where the high water level of a lake or river meets the land, period. For Georgian Bay, this level shall be measured as 177.4 CGD. And that is the definition. So there is, with all due respect, high water marks on all of the water bodies in the township of Georgian Bay. And they act as the basis of separation between the terrestrial zones, I'll call them, and the zones that apply in the aquatic areas. And again, there are some EP zones that can apply on both sides of that high water mark, but most of the zones are on one side or the other. And in terms of our zoning bylaw, again, something that we're not changing, that is going forward in the housekeeping, is the notion of the LS zone. And the LS zone applies to all of the lands below the high water marks that are generally under the water, but the zoning bylaw does provide for a current water mark that can be below the high water mark. If the current water level is above the high water mark, then the water body is in flood. And of course, then we speak to the issues of floodplains and other matters. And then in terms of your first point, yes, we will very much want to look at those kinds of issues, but that may be something more for a review as opposed to housekeeping. Because when we're looking at changing the zoning bylaw, we generally are trying to avoid that. The one exception we've made here was with the Oak Bay zone and section 3. We either had to propose a different amendment to section 3, where we created the ability for site-specific exception to site-specific exception zones, which we felt was not a good way to do this, or we had to tidy up that anomaly in our current zoning bylaw. And so those would be my quick answers.
Thank you, and Mayor, I'll just interject here to say that I'm really just recommending that we're talking about apples and oranges when it's water level, and I think the Great Lakes are distinctive in it. It's climate that affects the water level, not a spring flood, which is very temporary and it doesn't last for 3, 5 years, 10 years. So there's quite a difference, and that's why I'm suggesting from a nomenclature perspective, might make some sense to have 2 terms as opposed to 1 term. That's all. Thank you.
I'm just going to follow up on that. I noticed the lack of the term floodplain for any of the inland lake area, and I think apropos of Councillor Cooper's comments, I think we should be discerning or defining a difference between floodplain and high water mark, only because for the reasons already given. I think the reference is important because everybody in the inland lakes, the Muskoka area, and I believe the GIS even has floodplain mapping now as well. I think it's important to have at least some sort of reference to floodplain for the internal inland lake and river systems within our nomenclature, because otherwise people are not going to, I think there may be some confusion as to what you're talking about, because floodplain is very understandable to many, many people, whereas high water mark is a different term. It sort of means the same thing in many respects, but it refers to a different set of circumstances. And I think we've got to make sure somewhere in here, whether it's now or later housekeeping, we're making corrections, that we have some sort of reference to floodplain, even if it's some way of putting a note in there going high water means floodplain level in the inland lakes. That is my comment.
It is an absolute must. It's on the preliminary list of things to do for the review and update. The problem is from a housekeeping perspective, it isn't just the definitions that would be impacted. It's a whole host of provisions and regulations, requirements, restrictions, and provisions or permissions. And that is really beyond what we're doing with this project.
I understand. Thank you.
Just a quick comment before we carry, well, a couple of quick comments. I really appreciate and I'm quite impressed with all the work that planners Kratky and Wanfor have done for us. I think this was, and I think we couldn't have 2 better planners attacking it, given the attention to detail and the organizational skills that between them they demonstrate very well, on top of everything else they do. So I really appreciate that. I think it's always tough for us as we review this to distinguish between what's housekeeping and what is updates that are going to be part of the official plan and zoning bylaw reviews. But I trust that the planners are taking note when we make comments that may fall more into the update category versus housekeeping, because, you know, the line between the 2 is a little gray, but I just want to say how much I really appreciate this, and I'm going to encourage you to go on to the next section, because I'm sure more questions will follow.
Okay, through the mayor. Section 4, general provisions, has been organized in a way that prevents or reduces the need for page hopping and with user friendliness in mind. Requirements that are frequently sought out by our residents were moved to the front of this section. Staff attempted to group sections together in situations where one mentioned the other and/or to create a better flow of information. For example, narrow water bodies, formerly subsection 4113.6, and Trent Severn Waterway, formerly section 439, are now under section 419, shoreline accessory buildings and structures water-based. The housekeeping bylaw contains an introduction section in 4.1, And sorry, just one moment. Accessory building structures and uses, which also refers to those who are interested in developing such within the Cognizant coastal waterfront community to additional requirements outlined in section 417. In the existing zoning bylaw, there is no introduction, and requirements specific to Cognizant were spread throughout the beginning of section 4.1. By creating the Cognizant Coastal Waterfront Community General Accessory Building and Structure Requirements section, it makes it easier for those within and outside of Cognizant to locate applicable requirements. Note that our other waterfront communities have limited, if any, requirements currently located at the beginning of section 4.1, and therefore staff did not create a new subsection for each.
Quick question then, just for section 4.1. Section 4.1 is titled.
It's already on. General accessory buildings and structures.
Okay, that's why I was making sure. Thank you.
Okay, sections 412 and 413 in our current zoning bylaw speak to front yard setback and yard requirements and clarify as such on islands. Meanwhile, section 417 in our current bylaw also speaks to yard requirements. These sections were combined in the housekeeping bylaw, forming section 415. In our current bylaw, it is difficult to locate requirements for residential fences. Staff have clarified the requirements in housekeeping by clearly separating and listing such at the beginning of section 4. Just shown here on my screen. Planning staff understand that the vast majority of properties within the township are within our waterfront communities. Therefore, in sections 418, shoreline accessory buildings and structures land-based, and 419, shoreline accessory buildings and structures water-based of the housekeeping bylaw, we created subsections for each waterfront community which clearly list additional requirements that are specific to each community. The start of these sections also now have similar introductions which basically say, in addition to the required setbacks outlined in section 415, an in-water boathouse, etc., may be permitted appurtenant to a lot. For additional requirements specific to your waterfront community, refer to subsections 4197, Cognizant, 4198, Go Home, etc., as the case may be. The following requirements shall apply. In our existing zoning bylaw, these requirements are mixed together and with those that apply to waterfront properties outside of a waterfront community. And we'll pause for questions.
I have a question for you. And I'm trying to find it here, but I was under the impression that there were certain parts of our township where you can build a boat port or a dryland boathouse. But there's a third category, which is a boathouse on a cribs in the water. And there's some that are existing, but what I'm asking is, do we make any comment here about boathouses on cribs in, especially on the Great Lakes where there's a 7-foot swing and a boathouse on cribs doesn't work. So we have to sometimes have verbiage to help protect people from themselves, so to speak. Do you have any verbiage in there about that particular issue?
Through the mayor, that verbiage was not in the current zoning bylaw, so it's not in the housekeeping bylaw. And we also do not speak to construction for our buildings and structures in the zoning bylaw.
Sorry, so is that something that if it's not in there now, you're saying, is that correct? It could be dealt with when we do the full review.
Through the mayor, potentially.
Sorry?
Potentially, yes.
Potentially, yeah, I'm not saying that you're promising today to do it, but I'm just suggesting that it's like so many of these bylaws, we have them in place to protect people from themselves in a way. And that's why most of the the crib dock boathouses on Georgian Bay have disappeared because of a 7-foot swing. You'd need a aerial ladder to get out of your boat in some cases. So that's why they disappeared, so to speak. I'm sure that Councillor Jarvis can attest to the same thing. So there you go. I just wanted to make that point, that it's important to, and I thought there was actually something in the Cognizine language about that, that you could have a boat port. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe there is in Cognizine, and again, if it was in place in a particular community, it's preserved. I don't think it prohibits cribs, but I think it required floating, didn't it?
Floating boat port, in other words. I think it does. I think there's something somewhere. All I do is draw attention to that because it's in reality, it could be a problem anywhere on Georgian Bay. Thank you.
Not sure if we're supposed to address ourselves through the mayor, but one thing I'm concerned with, and I have been ever since I came onto council, is the regulations regarding dredged out. I don't even know how to put this. I'll give you an example. Our family cottage is on Georgian Bay, but it is on a dredged out canal. It's not natural. It's only 30 feet wide, quarter of a mile long type of thing coming in. So it's not really Georgian Bay, it's man-made. And how would the regulations be different on that channel than they would be, say, in natural Georgian Bay? Or do we have any provisions that allow for this?
So right now, the zoning bylaw, both as it exists and as we've proposed it, treats all waters associated with Georgian Bay as a part of Georgian Bay. Whether they were a part of Georgian Bay through interaction with the environment, such as, say, the upper reaches of Go Home Bay, or whether they're a part of Georgian Bay through man-made intervention, such as Little Dog Channel. So at this point, the zoning bylaw, both as it exists and as we are proposing it, would consider it to be Georgian Bay.
So in the case, say, of Oak Bay, where they blasted out the whole basin, which is a marina, that is now Georgian Bay, even though it only has a 10-foot wide canal coming into it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Would the same apply to Cognizine Lake? It's natural, but it's only about 10 feet wide in spots. So, you know, it's whether it's natural or unnatural, it's still the water body is the level of the water body is going to be affected by the Great Lakes.
Okay, I will continue. So section 411, legal non-complying lots, buildings, and structures has been substantially revised. The term legally existing has been replaced with legal non-complying. Non-compliance as a result of expropriation or widening has been added for clarification purposes. Paragraph C of the section in our current zoning bylaw has been relocated and rephrased in paragraph E4, which contains requirements for expansions to legal non-complying shoreline dwellings. Also in 411E, staff made it so that someone can look in the section pertaining to their dwelling location rather than in multiple paragraphs to determine permitted expansion. So for example, in our current bylaw, section 411E1 identifies the permitted expansions for a dwelling within 10 meters of the front lot line, which includes a 25% increase to gross floor area and a width increase of 20%. However, section 4 on the following page states notwithstanding these expansions, the gross floor area may increase to 95 square meters and the width may increase by 6 meters. Now, in the housekeeping bylaw, these exceptions or expansions are integrated and not contained within a separate provision. Section 412, legal nonconforming uses, remains same except for the relocation of G, existing docks on water access properties, to Section 4192, docks, ramps, and boat lifts, understanding that this is the section residents turn to for dock requirements. In our current zoning bylaw, the docks, ramps, and boat lifts section contains 18 requirements listed A through R. Not only did staff relocate dock requirements specific to a waterfront community, but we also organized the requirements into the following categories: number of docks, separation and location, size, and additional requirements. Staff have also removed or limited the number of footnotes in tables throughout the zoning bylaw. For example, footnotes 1 and 2 of the table on the permitted yard encroachment section of our current zoning bylaw are now B and C. And we'll pause once more for questions.
Just a quick question. I was a bit confused. I thought we limit the number of docks to 2, and this says 4. Is the limitation to 2 in certain areas of the bylaw, or is it just is this new, or has it always been there? I guess.
To address your question, staff have not changed any of the provisions. We have simply just relocated and reorganized. So provisions specific to Cognition waterfront community, for example, those provisions that are related to water-based shoreline structures in that community are now located in that community's section. Does that make it a little more clear?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean there. So have we changed anything in terms of the allowance for the number of docks?
No,
That's
we did not change any requirements.
So 4 docks are allowed as long as you have X amount of frontage. So 4 docks are allowed anywhere? Well, so I'm asking, I think if it's in a community plan.
Yes. Yeah, let's do that.
Sorry for the 20 questions. I'm just trying to get to the bottom. Sorry?
Yeah, okay.
Oh, well.
If I may, while they're looking it up, I just want to say to council, we appreciate the eagle eyes. That's why we're bringing this forward. And even subsequent to this meeting, right, when you find stuff, let us know.
Thank you.
It says for lots with greater than the frontage, 1 additional dock may be permitted for each, up to a maximum of 4. Right?
So again, so Shania's slides are trying to show the general situation. I believe it's 4.1.9 has a number of subsections in it, which deals with in-water structures and boathouses, docks, etc. And in there, it includes community-specific requirements. So the way in which the zoning bylaw has been reorganized in this proposed housekeeping amendment is to separate sort of, if you're in a community, don't look at the introduction, go to your community. And I believe there's actually a note or something along the lines of saying that, please check for your community. And later on in the various subsections in section 4, each community has its own requirements listed for that community. So for example, where Go Home Bay has limits on the number of docks and the cumulative area of docks, that's under 4.1.9.8 now, as opposed to being a footnote to a table, which someone had to sort out for themselves. And so Shania actually was the one who drafted this and knows it better. But my understanding is that's the way we've moved it, is away from that single tabular representation with a lot of confusing footnotes to a paragraph description, sometimes with a table still in that introductory paragraph, and later on with details for each community under that community.
And just to add, at the start of each, the water-based and land-based accessory structure requirements section, it does say, and I did kind of briefly highlight this, that if you are in essentially a waterfront community, that not only do you read what's to follow, but you need to look at your waterfront community specific requirements, and it says what section in that introduction paragraph that they need to turn to.
So you're just trying to make it clear.
Exactly. Yes. No provisions are changing. We're just
Thank you.
reorganizing and trying to clarify and make it more user friendly.
Thank you.
Just to add to that, what may end up happening is we find types of errors like this as a result of their cleanup that we can therefore concentrate on, which we haven't been able to find in the past and may be easier to find with your hard work in getting all this stuff cleaned up. Thank you.
I think Councillor Jarvis, you brought up what I consider a key point in all this great work that I'm seeing, is that this is going to be easier for our residents to use, to read, to understand, and as you say, therefore, better inform our zoning bylaw review that's coming up, because they'll better understand what the existing bylaw actually says. So I'm sorry, but I'm repeating myself, but I applaud these efforts. I think it's fantastic that that we have two very careful planners reviewing our current bylaw, because it's going to make it easier for our review for our next bylaw.
So section 5 is about parking, and most of section 5 has been left untouched. That being said, there were a few areas where we felt improvements could be made. And again, we're not changing content, but we are changing the way in which it's represented. And one of those was queuing lanes for drive-throughs. And so we have attempted to more clearly express what the previous requirements in section 5.2.21 were in 5.3, which is a new subsection within section 5. And the next slide continues the minor changes that have been made in the parking requirements with regards to loading spaces. And the renumbering was necessitated merely because of the addition of a 5.3 with regards to queuing lanes. And again, there was no intent to change any of those requirements. So if any of you see something that we missed, i.e. it was in the bylaw, isn't there now, circle it, highlight it, make sure we have it, because we want it to be there. But it is a different way of expressing it. And the hope is that it will be more clear, in this case, to people who are, small business owners and or developers when they're making it. Yes.
So don't want to be too nitpicky either, because I know we need to get through this entire document. But in one section, 4.1.10 for sleeping cabins, so in general, I think for 4.1.9 and 11, you were saying that at the end of the section, you will have the different community plans broken out as a sub item so that you can identify that more easily for the residents. And in 4.1.10, the last item is noted, but it's not broken out as another sub item. So just from a consistency perspective, do you want us to go through all of this to try to find these, or is it so clear that that last point is the encapsulation of all the community plans that it's fine the way it is and I'm just wasting our time?
So the only time we created dedicated sections for the waterfront communities was under the water-based shoreline accessory structures and the land-based shoreline accessory structures, with the exception of Cognizine, which I said at the start of 4.1 had a lot of very particular general requirements to that community. So we created a section at the start of 4.1 for that as well. But in terms of your sleeping cabin, your detached garage,
But detached
they're
garages, I
not,
think you did. Oh, no, you didn't. Yeah, okay.
we don't separate out waterfront community provisions simply because there's not many, if any.
Okay, and they're all common.
Exactly.
Okay. Yep, thank you. Just making sure I get the scope.
If somebody's speaking, I'm not hearing it.
Or will this document not make any changes, so we don't need to create legal non-conforming status for everything? That is going to be something that would happen at a comprehensive review when things are actually changed. In other words, if you say docks can only project 40 feet now, then everybody who has a 90-foot dock would be legal non-conforming. And that's something I've never been clear on as a counselor, because we make changes, but the existing structures now become non-conforming.
Because this is housekeeping, we are trying not to change anything that would cause a legal non-complying or legal non-conforming, would have an outcome of creating an acquired right for someone. I think we need to be cautious that we have adjusted some of the definitions, and we're going to get to that as we go in, but that would be the place that everyone should keep that in mind, because it's a very good point. And we've tried to keep that in mind, but when we're thinking about the definitions and how they've changed, that's sort of a lens that's very important to keep in mind.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
I think we've covered loading. What's the next slide? So again, with the loading spaces, we've tried to preserve everything. It's a restatement of what was there, but hopefully in a way that is easier to understand. And again, if that's not the case, so if we've missed the mark, if you don't think it's easier to understand, let us know. But again, there shouldn't be any actual change.
Just to add to that, section 5 of the zoning bylaw is going to be one where you can easily see the changes if you have the consolidation up on one screen and the housekeeping bylaw up on the other. Because there was minimal, if any, reorganization of that section. It was just reformatting.
I think you're up with section 6 and 7.
Can you, sorry, go back to that, because I just, clarification, if you don't mind. Can you just pull up that previous slide? Obviously, I'm getting a pretty good grasp of what you're trying to achieve here, and I think I understand it. But in this case, you've taken two items out of the existing 5.3.4 and 5.3.5. Have they been moved somewhere? I don't see them incorporated into the 5.4.1.
So I believe they are incorporated earlier on in the previous slide. So there's been a reorganization. The two slides, we had difficulty recreating this in a way that we could show it to you in its totality.
Okay, and I figured that might be what was happening. Okay, thanks.
But the intention is, again, that 5.4 covers off what 5.3 permitted required, but in a slightly different way.
So
Am I the first person to learn that we had something in our zoning bylaw on queuing lines and loading spaces? They clearly don't come very often in front of us for applications.
I've known that for years.
So section 5.4 is loading space requirements, whereas section 541 is location of loading spaces. And it consolidated essentially 533, 534, 535 into that section.
Thank you. So I presume that it just becomes easier to look up.
Yeah. All right, section 6 and 7. So across most zones, staff revised the introductory statement in the permitted uses section, and we removed footnotes from the zone requirements table so that they are now paragraphs following the ABC format. In section 6, which is our shoreline residential zones, and section 7, which is the shoreline residential island zones, we created subsections for each waterfront community that has specific requirements, whereas in our current zoning bylaw, they are mixed with each other. And we originally had a question stop here, but we've kind of ask some questions along the way, so if it's okay to keep moving. No questions?
No, it's good. I mean, you actually answered the questions as we went, as you suggested, which is good.
Section 8 is one of the sections that we did have information in our report that was important, and I'm also showing something here to try and reinforce what has already been discussed, and that is the shift away from footnotes to a table and to separate paragraphs within a section. The shift from footnotes to paragraphs is shown above. We didn't include the table because it's there. Its contents stay the same with the exception of the very important change to lot coverage for the BR zone. The backlot residential zone is, generally speaking, a zone with private individual water and sewer services. It is not a zone one would anticipate having the highest lot coverage permitted in the township. When we looked at bylaw 9119, the backlot residential zone had a maximum 5% lot coverage. 5% seems to be a very reasonable amount for a lot coverage for private services. We believe that there was a typographical error that was never caught in 2014-75 that created the backlot residential zone as the highest intensity of land use in this municipality. And we did a check of the largest existing development on a backlot residential zone, and it is less than 5%. It's on Lone Pine, or sorry, it's on Bonneville Road, and some of you may know it. But it is well below 5%. So we are proposing through housekeeping to restore 9119's 5% coverage as a maximum for the backlot residential zone.
Sorry, is that part of this slide, or is that?
Yes, it is.
I think it was at 55%, was it not?
Correct.
I could use that kind of coverage.
So it was removed? Is that what you're saying when that 5% was somehow overlooked?
Yeah, we assume it was a type stutter. Somebody hit 5 twice when they meant to hit it once, and then no one caught it.
Oh, so it says 55. Yeah. I'm sorry, I missed that part. That sounds a little extreme. Thank you.
It's the highest permitted lot coverage of any zone in this municipality. It's higher than any of the multiple residential zones. It's higher than any of the commercial zones that are fully serviced. It is an anomaly that is clearly, we believe, a typographical error, and therefore can be corrected by housekeeping. The next slide is, we're getting into, oh, thank you. I got ahead of myself. So again, this is just a demonstration of how we're moving from this footnote to a paragraph approach. But this is important because of the next series of slides which speak to Oak Bay. And I think what's key to understand is that development in our multiple residential zones cannot take place on private services. It must be serviced by water and sewer provided by the district. And we felt that wasn't necessarily especially clear through a footnote, so we've elevated it to a subsection as a general prohibition. Next, and again, this is because Oak Bay was a site-specific exception zone, the RM43 and RM43H zone. And then there were a series of exceptions to the exception zone. So we have proposed elevating Oak Bay to a separate zone, which we have called the Oak Bay Residential Multiple Zone. And what you see in the top is the proposed table of uses. And what you see below is the existing table of uses for the residential multiple zones, plus the columns dealing with use in the RM43 zone. And those should align. We believe they do. And yeah, so it's column 6 that includes the Oak Bay zone.
Then, if you don't mind me asking, and if, for example, in the RM4 exceptions, that exceptions to the exceptions, as you call it, I think, for instance, dwelling semi-detached, Where does that come in to the new, where does that cover the new chart?
So again,
how?
we haven't actually changed any of the other site-specific exceptions. So the other site-specific exception tables and exceptions remain. What we have changed is we have added an additional zone, Oak Bay Residential Multiple, and we've then moved those to a new table, which I will be getting to, which was intended to completely recreate those zones, not necessarily in the same way, because we're trying to simplify things through housekeeping, but to include all of the content.
So you're saying that that table 9.6 bottom right of the slide here is actually partially incorporated into column 6 in the revision, but also you've got it itemized somewhere else?
No. So
Okay.
again, the RM43 zone would be disappearing because it becomes the OBRM zone.
Thank you.
Yep. So with the zone requirements in the Oak Bay Residential Multiple Zone, most of the definitions and other things have moved into our section 19. One exception is a very unique definition of front yard that applies to now the RM43 zone. And in this case, will continue to apply to the OBRM zone, but through a paragraph in section 9.3. Later on in the definition of a yard, you will see there's a bracket. If you're looking for the OBRM zone definition of yard, go see paragraph 9.3b. Yes, yep. And that's what Oak Bay is a part of. Yes. And so it's the next slide. And I've started talking about the next slide actually.
Sorry, going back, where is table 9.2 then, or is that not even pertinent? It's just a reference to it is the important part in the previous slide. Sorry. You go zone requirements 9.3, and then you have table 9.2.
So we aren't making any changes to the table?
Right. So it still exists. It's just in the table will be there at some point in time.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
No, the table is there. So if you look at the copy that's attached to our report,
yeah,
it's there.
Okay.
It's just we didn't have enough space on our slides to make them legible.
Absolutely fine. Okay, but it does bring one other question to mind, and I don't think it's pertinent to what we're doing now, but something maybe we should be noting down. Do we have a proper definition for front yard?
Yes,
because
we do.
It becomes an issue on waterfront properties, particularly island waterfront properties.
Yes, we do, and we have adjusted it, and it's actually later on in our presentation.
Oh wow, I'm way ahead of you. Wow, amazing. Okay, thanks.
So we're into Oak Bay, and essentially, again, we've begun to discuss this already, so I think we probably can move to the next slide because we've included some definitions in section 19 for Oak Bay. We've held one in particular in the section 9.4A. And again, these slides become difficult to read as you go further in because with reorganizing some of the approach and text, it's very difficult to align the approach. But again, the Oak Bay Residential Multiple Zone permissions and requirements should be identical to the RM43 zone that you see below. And so the idea is, if we've made a mistake, we're definitely going to correct it. We're working as well with the owner and their planner to make sure that we don't make an error, but certainly we welcome anyone providing us with comments.
I just want to add for a point of clarification. So in section 9, you have your residential multiple zones. You have your permitted use table, which identifies the permitted use now as well for the Oak Bay residential multiple zone. But then you have your zone requirements that are only specific to multiple residential zones, not including Oak Bay. Then after your residential multiple zone requirements, you have a separate section dedicated to Oak Bay residential multiple, and it speaks to their specific zone requirements, which is what you're seeing here on the screen as table 9.3.
And that's an excellent point. And that is, again, because Oak Bay is a rather unique situation. But that being said, again, it now would be a zone, and that's why it is a subsection and its own table within that subsection.
Again, I understand what you just said, but if we took, for instance, a possible new build, I'll look at Severn Heights as a possibility. Will we be trying to be more specific, or are we going to get into the same situation where we have to put in a full subsection on?
So far,
You see Shania shaking her head. Okay.
So far, Port Severn Heights doesn't have any site-specific exceptions to a site-specific exception.
Not yet.
That being said, if a new developer started to make those kinds of proposals, then I think, yes, absolutely, we would be looking to create another primary zone for that community. And I think one way to look at it might be that just as we have different shoreline residential and shoreline residential island zones by community, in this case, we may be looking at zones by community within the urban places in the township.
Logical, thanks.
So returning to Oak Bay, I think we can move to the next slide. No, you're already at the next slide. Essentially, again, you'll see that we've attempted in the Oak Bay residential multiple zone to recreate the paragraphs that were previously in column 5 of the RM43 zone. The numbering is oftentimes preserved, but sometimes does change, and it changes from Roman numerals in this case to alphabetic numerals, which is the approach of our zoning bylaw, with the exception of some subsections which have been newly numbered. In the next slide, you will see that the permitted development within the various blocks of the Oak Bay subdivision have been recreated again, this time leaving column 5 and finding their way into paragraph J and a table that is within that paragraph. But again, there's been no amendment or revision to what is currently in the RM43 zone. And lastly, again, the numbering works out of alignment, but again, all of the paragraphs that are currently in that column 5 find their way into the Oak Bay multiple residential zone. Next, we looked at creating these new site-specific exceptions to the Oak Bay multiple residential zone, and we adopted a very simple approach, which was that the letter A became a 1. So in the old RM43A zone, it would now be an OBRM exception 1 zone. And again, what we have tried to do, although we've moved from a 6-column site-specific exception zone table, which Shania, I believe, mentioned in her discussion regarding the shoreline residential zones. So throughout all of our tables, there's been a move away from an extra column. We have reduced the number of columns for the site-specific exception zones.
Across the whole zoning bylaw, across all of our exception tables, just want to point that out.
Where that was important, there has oftentimes been text added, but the column 5 now has a dual title to it. And the title has gone from special zone requirements to modifications and additional requirements. And column 6 has disappeared, which was once titled other special provisions. And the reason we went with modifications was because, generally speaking, column 5 was used when you were modifying provisions or requirements of the zone above the site-specific exception zone. And generally speaking, the other special requirements were additional requirements. They were requirements that were not previously in the zone. And so we felt that that new title allowed us to synthesize those two columns into a single column and thereby make more efficient use of the page and allow for better AODA compliance. But in the case again of Oak Bay in particular, and I think we'll just scroll through the next few slides quickly. The intent was that everything that was in an that was in an RM4 3A, 3B, or 3C zone is now in an OBRM 1, 2, or 3 zone. And certainly if there is a mistake, we will correct it before we bring it back to you at a public meeting. And we would appreciate certainly if anyone does see that, that you bring it to our attention. And I think that brings us to our next period for questions. But we've sort of had an ongoing dialogue, so maybe we'll just keep on.
I have one question, if I may. Did I ever hear that you are reviewing all your changes to the Oak Bay zoning housekeeping with the Oak Bay planner?
Yes, so we have
Okay.
started discussions with Celeste. We will
Excellent.
re-engage her after this meeting. As well, we will begin discussions with 2 of the landowners in the mapping exercise whose lands, the rights will not change, but their lands will be renumbered because the site-specific exception zones, and that was back on the 3rd slide, were mistakenly numbered with
Yes.
the number that was previously used.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I just wanted to confirm that Oak Bay is fully aware of this housekeeping and are reviewing it, what effect it may or may not have on them.
We have already reached out to Oak Bay. We will continue to reach out to Oak Bay, and we will actively engage the 2 other parties directly so that they are aware shortly after this meeting.
Thank you.
So sections 11, 12, both in terms of table 11.2 and 12.2 have been changed with the same philosophy that other tables were changed. And that is generally speaking that we're trying to simplify the way in which the information is available. But in this case, there's not just the footnotes that are moving to paragraphs below the table. There's also some tabular information that has been removed from the table because it was only applicable to one or the other of the columns in the table. And that is true in different ways in section 12, but we've just illustrated it with section 11. And certainly if you have any questions or comments, we'd be happy to discuss that with you.
At the risk of sounding really anal, why do we refer to the tourist commercial as CT as opposed to TC?
We don't know.
Okie dokie. Might be something we want to look at down the road.
I suspect it's so that the lettering stays associated with the commercial zone.
So we should refer to that as commercial tourists as opposed to, I mean, just to me, never mind, whatever.
Because we also have CM for commercial marina.
Oh, yep.
Thank you. And just looking at, actually, if we could go back to the previous page. There we go. In the proposed, if there were to be an amendment on the CTS side of things, would that go through the Committee of Adjustments? Or would that be not a minor variance, but a zoning amendment? So I'll give you an example of a matter. If a commercial property wants to reduce its side yard setback from 20 meters to 15 meters, could that be done through the Committee of Adjustments, or would it need a zoning amendment?
Yes.
Okay.
But if they wanted to reduce it from 20 to 0, then it might more likely be dealt with as a site-specific zoning bylaw.
Perfect, thank you.
Sections 14.2 and 15.2 were tables that previously were applicable to only one zone. And while the tables are informative when you have multiple zones within an overall section, staff felt that it was more efficient and more clear if in the case where there is only a single zone in a section, that the uses move from the table with a lot of check marks strictly to a paragraph. And so you'll see above that the proposed text is very brief and succinct, and we believe clear.
Understand. I see that the brevity being a good idea, but it becomes less easy to find those specific uses in a sentence that has been proposed here versus what exists. I'm just thinking it's easier to look at the list and go, oh, there it is, as opposed to reading. Anyway, just an observation.
And we brought this to your attention for that reason. Yeah. Of course, it's a choice. And if council feels strongly that any of these choices that we're trying to make are maybe not helping with clarity, we're happy to back them out. So, you know, I think the question is, are there other councillors who may share your concern?
Yeah, my preference would be the chart. I don't think the sentence above it is probably a little too long in description, but the chart to me makes more sense from a reference standpoint.
If I may, we also removed the whole explaining if there's a check mark, that use is permitted in that.
Which is good, yeah, I guess.
So
it seems a little redundant, yeah.
perhaps we can just organize, oops, what did I do?
Maybe just a bullet list.
I'm thinking more like a list as opposed to a table. Do we want to do
yes.
that? Yeah, I think that would be very clear. Someone write that down.
Yeah, I find myself disagreeing with Councillor Jarvis simply because one sentence to me is a lot more to the point than half a page with a chart where every single item has a tick mark.
So we could keep this sentence, but where it says uses permitted in the institutional zone are as follows, that can be in a list.
We wouldn't use bullet points in the bylaw because, again, they have to be
No.
numbered paragraphs, but we would do it in a paragraph, so it would be A, B, C, D.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's obvious that the mayor and I think differently on things, and that's allowed, obviously. But I like the idea of the list, yeah.
For what it's worth, I'm fine with the sentence, but I'm.
Well, at least I have one Steve on my side.
Maybe
if I
the
was
Steves are split.
Maybe we should sort of have council kind of explore this because
Yeah.
it's two sections and
it's too minor. I wouldn't worry about it. Do
one
what
is
you think is best,
institutional.
but
One
I
is-
would. I was just going to say I would use Control F and search for if I was looking for an acceptable use for a daycare zone. I would be using Control F, and I wouldn't. The list would be irrelevant.
Is someone speaking?
Are we talking about cemetery usage here?
No, I'm
Because
just
digging
saying
deep
that
is
I
an
would
issue.
never dig in this deep to ever find this because you're bringing it to us in a report anyways and making a recommendation. So I think it doesn't matter to me which way this is, but for simplicity, I really think that a list would be the best.
So I think we're hearing from council that as a compromise, it's the paragraphs where each use is a separate A, B, C, D, etc., as opposed to returning to a table.
I would agree.
Okay. Oh, yes. This has been a topic of a number of applications recently, and we are not opening up the bigger issues that many of you probably want to talk about with respect to some of these zones. But what we're trying to do, again, is by reducing the number of zones that are discussed in the tables, where only those zones that have some permission for land use are considered. The others are falling under a paragraph that says these zones do not have permitted uses. We're trying to clarify again where there is potential for some use and where there is none. And in table 18, we've made one change, and we know that council has heard many staff say over and over again, we can't change conditions. In this case, this is a condition that is requested by the district, and our bylaw is out of touch with what they currently wish to request. And it would actually be impossible for anyone to now satisfy the existing H6. And so in this case, because H6 is as dictated by the district and would not cause hardship for anyone who is currently trying to satisfy an H6, it actually allows them to do so. We are recommending through housekeeping that this new wording that the district has requested be included as H6. And lastly, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail and definitions. We've made some changes. Most of the changes are as shown on this slide, and this is just an illustration because there happen to be two changes back to back on the slide that illustrate those changes. One of those changes is that we've corrected legislative references. There were some outdated legislative references, so you'll see that in day nursery it now refers to the correct legislation that is currently in effect at the provincial level. You'll also see that with deck, we haven't tried to reinvent what we actually define a deck to be, but we have tried to clarify so that someone might be less able to abuse the definition of deck. And a lot of the definition changes that we are proposing in housekeeping fall under that category. There's one term that we are proposing deleting, and that's existing. Our bylaw had an unworkable definition of existing. It said that if it existed at the date of enactment of 2014-75, it was existing. That is an impossible situation for planning staff to deal with. The definition of the word existing is well documented by multiple dictionaries and legal texts that allow us to understand what the word existing means. So we've
Do you have the definition for us to see?
Sorry?
Do you have the definition for us to see?
We can put those up. So the definitions are in the text that was given to you. And if there's a definition that any of you want to discuss, either that falls under either one of these categories, yes. I'm about to show you two that we want to discuss with you.
Existing isn't in the definition list.
Oh, no. So we've removed it.
So it's not just that you changed the definition, you just removed it from our
We believe
zoning
it is
bylaw.
perfectly defined by common dictionaries and or legal dictionaries, that there is no need for our zoning bylaw to give a meaning of the word existing, let alone a meaning that is unworkable.
And I just want to add clarity to that point. Note that earlier, when we were speaking about legal non-complying and legal non-conforming, that we removed the reference to existing and replaced it with legal non-conforming or legal non-complying.
A grammatical item just under deck. I was just reading the definition as you posted it here. And I'm wondering if maybe this is, I mean, I could go through the whole thing and this is crazy. The second line under deck, surrounded by railings where elevated, wouldn't it be and elevated above ground?
So my
I
understanding
mean,
is
it's the type of thing, this is getting really into the weeds here.
Yes, and we're trying to stay out of the weeds, but my understanding is the building code doesn't require railings, for example, if the deck is essentially just sitting on the ground. And there can be decks that may be sitting on the ground.
Agreed entirely, but again, surrounded by railings where elevated above ground, surrounded by railings and elevated above ground, doesn't that better define it? It's one word. And maybe I should be just leaving this alone.
No, so there are two different things. So and requires both things to be true. Where says that something in some instances may be true.
Appreciate the clarification. Yeah.
May not. And so again, we encourage you to go through those definitions because we have made changes and we're not going to show you each and every one today. Yep.
So railings. Railings can also be a visual in the way of sight lines, especially inside a building. So my question is, you talk here about elevated above the ground. And let me give you an example. You can have tiers of steps. Why do you need a railing? Because there's only 7, 8 inches between each step, and you've got a step like this, and you go down in a tier. Why would you need a railing?
So again, the zoning bylaw has never tried to duplicate the building code, and we are still trying to avoid that. So whether or not a railing is required is a matter for the Ontario Building Code.
Okay.
And it is
Or
for
our
our building
bylaws.
staff. What our definition in this case is intended to achieve is it's intended to recognize that there may be situations where somebody proposes a deck where a railing isn't required, but there may be situations where decks are elevated well above the ground, sometimes a meter, sometimes even 2, where railings absolutely are required. The same is true of stairs, etc. So we are not wanting to change the building code or duplicate the building code or try and exceed the building code through our zoning bylaw because we have no authority to do so. In fact, one of the legal citations that we corrected, the building code citations were out of date. And we decided that the building code is so ubiquitous that we would simply refer to it as the Ontario Building Code so as not to ever have a situation where our current zoning bylaw refers to a previous edition of the Ontario Building Code. So that is one of the changes that we've made within various definitions where we've changed the citation for the building code to simply be the Ontario Building Code. But again, our definitions in the zoning bylaw are about land use, yard requirements, and those types of issues, accessory buildings and structures, which a deck is one of those accessory structures. It is not whether a railing is or is not required.
I think if we just add a comma after, so it says an approximately horizontal surface surrounded by railings, maybe it should be comma, where elevated comma, or where elevated above the ground comma. I think that would make it more clear.
No, and again,
No?
I would
Okay.
encourage each and every one of you, yeah, if you have a suggestion how we might reconsider any change we've made to this, and I've invited you to do this before and I'm going to do it again, please scribble on a copy and give it to us, because again, we do want to consider it. But in this case, no, the definition was intended to ensure that we're not leaving aside things that might otherwise be considered a deck, simply because our definition wasn't sufficient enough to describe what a deck is. In my mind, if we're going to define something in our zoning bylaw, we better do it in a way that exceeds the English language. Otherwise, we shouldn't have it as a defined term in our zoning bylaw. We should rely on the dictionary as to what the word means. Where we have definitions in the zoning bylaw, it's intended to make sure that something by the common dictionary definition doesn't get overlooked. And I think one of the key things in our zoning bylaw that's important for a deck is this notion that it is a structure. Another key thing is that the activities that are taking place on it. And so we've tried to include that in the new definition. But again, if we've missed the mark, if you think a word needs to be better defined in our zoning bylaw, again, we encourage those suggestions. If a word doesn't need to be defined in our zoning bylaw, we encourage those suggestions too.
If I could just add, just on a comment with respect to the OBC as, for example, with septic systems, is a bare minimum. We actually have a 30-meter setback, not a 15-meter setback, and the Ontario government has clarified you've got to follow the most restrictive rules. And in our case, because of the district and our township, had a 30-meter setback. So that prevails, not the OBC.
Absolutely, because Section 34 of the Planning Act allows us in our zoning bylaw to specify requirements for setbacks. The Planning Act doesn't allow us to specify when handrails are needed on a structure.
In fact, somebody's just come in the room to talk about that, and I just thought I'd mention that I don't pay any attention to the OBC, but anyway, moving on.
Through the mayor, and I think Jeff answered it perfectly. So I don't think I need to add too much. Setbacks are one thing, building structural requirements are another.
So moving along to the next slide, which Shania has up already, one of the very important changes that we've made to the definitions is gross floor area. And we wrestled with this because we know how challenging it was to fall upon the two definitions that were previously in the zoning bylaw. However, our current zoning bylaw suffers from a strong weakness. We do speak about gross floor area for other zones, but we never defined it. And that is a bit of a challenge because the English dictionaries that are available don't do a particularly good job of defining gross floor area because it's a phrase, not a word. And so we are proposing that the gross floor area be rewritten and proposed as shown on this slide. And I think this is important maybe for each and every one of you to read if you haven't, and to let us know your thoughts. Yes.
Thank you. And one of the things that have perplexed me right from day one was the description of gross floor area never depicted the measured surface. In other words, my understanding when I came on council that gross floor area, you took a tape measure and you measured inside the building, the length and the width. If it's a one-story building, that's your gross floor area. But then I was told that it was the outside of the structure, which how does that create gross floor area in the building when you're measuring the outside? If you have 1 foot thick walls on both sides, it times that by the width of the building, there's a big difference in that figure. Gross floor area, I figured, should be the living area inside the building.
No, so again, floor area is within the walls. Gross floor area is grossed up for many things. And in a simple structure, it's grossed up for the area of the exterior walls and interior walls. For more complex structures, say a shopping mall or an office building, you would have common spaces, elevators, hallways, foyers, entryways, malls, food courts, etc. And those are all part of a gross floor area. And what's important is that our zoning bylaw right now, and we did not touch a word in numbers 1 and 2, which were the previous definitions of gross floor area in our zoning bylaw. We're not reopening that. That is, if it is going to be discussed, that is a discussion for the review and update. So the shoreline residential gross floor area definitions are not changing. What is unfortunate is that for more than a decade, this municipality has had provisions within its zoning bylaw that speak to gross floor area in other zones, which had no definition. And there are different professional bodies, legal bodies, design bodies, the International Standards Organization that have definitions of gross floor area. We considered those in writing number 3, but we want it to be simple, clear, and straightforward. And the idea of number 3 is that whether you're proposing an apartment building on Port Severn Road North, or a townhouse on Port Severn Road North, or whether you're proposing a warehouse on industrial lands in McTier, or whether you're proposing a new hotel across the street here in the central part of Port Severn, that definition of gross floor area includes all of the components that we need to make sure that those proposed developments are then correctly contemplated for parking requirements and other very important measures in our zoning bylaw. And so it is number 3 that we're here to look at today, and it's our first proposal. Certainly if people want to propose revisions, suggestions, we look forward to those. But no, gross floor area is everything. So anything associated with the building is meant to be included in that calculation.
As long as it's above 1.8 meters.
No, and that's where we've got a difference. We're being more simple with our definition of gross floor area, and we can get into that. We're trying to avoid the whole issue of whether it's a habitable space or not. So we're not distinguishing, say, between a commercial mezzanine in a warehouse that's meant to provide access to HVAC equipment for repair personnel. We're not including that. That wouldn't be part of gross floor area in number 3. But we are trying to ensure that the entire warehouse, from the exterior wall to the exterior wall, is included in gross floor area. We're not wanting to have the complexity of definition of gross floor area that we currently have for certain shoreline residential, well, for all shoreline residential zones. We're looking to leave this issue of story to the definition of story. We believe that definition is sufficient. And so we're trying to simply address gross floor area. And again, this is for all. Number 3 does not apply to shoreline residential. And we've tried to be clear. It only applies to all other zones.
Okay, a follow-up on that would be, and you'd have to explain this one to me, a building envelope that has a lower floor less than 1.8 meters is considered to be gross floor area. So we've had some people on 6 Mile Lake that have brought a cement truck in and filled in their basement with 4 feet of concrete in order to not include that in their gross floor area. Is this going to address that issue in any way, shape, or form?
No. We are avoiding opening the issue of the shoreline residential gross floor area in the housekeeping. All we have done is to renumber paragraphs that previously were disjointed and not clearly linked. The existing is below, and you can see that we started off with the definition of gross floor area. And then there's this note in bold that says, Cognizine coastal waterfront community, Wawatesi, etc. See this definition. Instead, what we've said is gross floor area has 3 different meanings, being 1, and 1 is the gross floor area that was previously in shoreline residential and shoreline residential island zones that were not subject to definition 2. And we've maintained the wording of the definition. And number 2 then is, again, unchanged. So the issue of people having to potentially fill their basement to avoid having GFA on 6 Mile Lake or any other shoreline residential zone is not being addressed by any of these changes. What's being addressed is that right now we have requirements in our zoning bylaw that speak to gross floor area for other zones, but we do not have a definition of gross floor area for the other zones. And so what we're saying is we need a definition because it's a phrase, it's not a single word. And we've taken the perspective of keep it simple, keep it straightforward, and where we're talking about stories, rely upon the definition of story. It is also in our zoning bylaw, as opposed to trying to put everything under a one-stop shop for gross floor area in other zones.
So you're basically just taking our existing documents and making them clearer. We're not making any changes?
No, we're adding a definition for gross floor area for all other zones. And that definition is for all other buildings and structures, gross floor area means the area measured between the exterior walls of heated or cooled spaces on all floors below, at, or above ground floor, excluding only indoor parking areas or attached garages for private vehicles not offered for sale, and basement or cellar floors where the floor to ceiling height is less than 1.8 meters. And that's the proposed slide, number 3.
Number 3 is that what you're?
Yes. Yep. And that's the new wording. And we're trying to be simple and straightforward with all other zones. We're trying not to get into this space that might be under overhangs or other issues. The ISO is the one that uses the heated or cooled spaces to distinguish whether it's gross floor area. And so we've adopted that International Standards Organization approach to gross floor area, but we've tried to tailor it in some fashion because, again, this would apply to the R zone, the RM zones, the MX zone, the MD zone, the C zones, the CT zones, anywhere where GFA is mentioned.
So non-residential, commercial.
No, all the residential zones that are not on the shoreline.
So SR as well.
Okay.
No, not SR. So SR still has its two definitions, 1 and 2, that haven't changed.
Thank you.
So what this affects is a house like, a home like mine, what's not shoreline, and I have a problem with, I have an 8-foot high basement in my home, which is classed as GFA, because I have to heat it. So my pipes don't freeze. We don't use it. It's a bare basement, never use it, but yet it's included in our GFA. That includes taxes and everything else that go along with it. So I'm not really cool with this, but I understand this is not the time for change. The time for change is when we do the official plan review, but we're at the 10-year mark, so I'm sure it's going to be happening real soon.
So now, for example, with the single-family residence, the only reason it would come into an application or would start to apply is if the residential dwelling was suddenly including an accessory residential unit. And then the parking issues would be triggered. But otherwise, in the single-family R1, R2, R3, R4 zones, there is no other requirement that's discussed in gross floor area as far as I'm aware, other than parking when you're dealing with an accessory residential unit. So again, this definition only is triggered where there's something in the zoning bylaw that says you need to calculate something, some requirement, based upon a gross floor area. To my knowledge, with a single family residence, it would only be triggered from the perspective of adding an additional residential within that dwelling.
Okay, and that's important because the provincial government is stressing the fact that we need to populate these basements with apartments. Yeah. And an ease to get to there for our R-zoned residents, I think, is important. In other words, if people on my street decide to convert all their basements into apartments to help with the housing crisis, we need to have a very clear, concise, and simple way to allow them to do that instead of putting up roadblocks. So I think I agree with what we have here, but at the time when we need to review our official plan, I think that's the time when we need to really make a cleaner, easier path and reduce some of these restrictions that are being not put in here, but are here existing.
And just carrying this example a little bit further forward, the answer is yes, and we've included that. So as staff, there's a lot of Section 5 that we're worried about. And for example, the parking requirements that would be triggered if you're adding an accessory residential unit may be out of date. And so one of the parts of the proposed preliminary review topics is reviewing all of the parking requirements in Section 5.
Great.
But that's beyond housekeeping. But right now, what this would do is it would clearly trigger Section 5. So someone couldn't say, well, you don't have a definition of gross floor area, so I don't know, what are you actually wanting? And so we're not adding any new provisions with this definition, but what we're doing is ensuring that someone can't excuse themselves from a requirement like parking simply because we don't define it.
Okay, and that answers everything that I want to know. The one thing I thought I was going to be able to change today was the fact that within our bylaws, an apartment can only be 50% of the gross floor area. And I thought maybe through this process here, we could up that, but that's going to be at the amendment stage. Okay, thank you.
If I could just make a comment or two, I mean, I don't know how many more pages and how much longer your presentation is going to go.
3
but
more slides.
How many?
3.
Okay, well, I guess we're on until dinner. Just a couple of quick things. I appreciate all this, and I understand that this is not the time that we're going to change our zoning bylaw. Rather, we're just doing housekeeping. But I've learned from this. I will comment that on point 2 under proposed, you have for all dwellings except and apartments, and I think you mean and without the D. Minor typo, but I have to try to get into the level of Jarvis and Cooper and these things sometimes. But it seems between 1 and 2, and I haven't read it carefully enough because it's such small print on my screen, but the biggest difference is breezeways. They're accepted and they're out, they're not included in part 1 and they are included in part 2. It seems like a heck of a lot of words if that's really the only difference. And I find it very interesting, part 3, the indoor parking spaces, and not if it's not heated or cooled, it doesn't count. And then I would think if your parking space is not heated or cooled, by saying it's a parking spot, it's almost redundant. But anyway, I find it's very interesting, but I think we have to be careful that we have spent a lot of time over the last 2 hours talking about changes that we're going to make potentially to the zoning bylaw versus just, the housekeeping. But on to the next 3 slides, please.
The one comment before we leave this slide, because I've got to get my 2 cents in.
And me
I
too.
was just going to say, perhaps because there's so many words in the list of what is included, this would maybe be better formatted in the table with 2 columns, or one for the standard and one for the community plans, and then you'd be able to see what was different. It would just be easier to read.
So section 19 is, that would be an anomaly in section 19. So that we've tried to keep everything that
As a
we
sentence.
didn't have to change. We're changing so much. So we were trying not to change anything that didn't need to be changed. And so this was written in a way that we felt fit with the rest of section 19. And in most other instances where there was multiple definitions of something, it said something means, and then there was 1, 2, 3, 4, or sometimes A, B, C, D, but it was always a numbered approach. Okay.
We can look at adding a space between the numbers as well to give it more separation.
So if I may,
Councillor Cooper, can you cover me for 2 minutes, please?
I'm sorry?
I have to step away for 2 minutes.
Oh, well, yeah, I'll make my comments up there then.
While we're waiting for Councillor Cooper to fill in for the mayor, really quickly, I caught the same thing that the mayor did on that number 2. I hope you guys understand, except an apartment building. So you took the D off, and good. And in number 1, you've got a separate sentence starting with a small b in breezeways. It's the second last sentence, I think. Breezeway should be capitalized there.
We are not capitalizing other defined terms in
At the beginning of a
definition.
sentence? Beginning of a sentence?
Where?
Second last sentence, number 1.
So if there are typos, we appreciate you pointing them out.
Yeah, that's
And
what I'm
yes,
doing. Yeah,
it
yeah.
will be addressed. Shania actually did the bulk of
Is
the
that supposed to
creation
be?
of the text.
Oh, so you're blaming her?
Is that a period?
No,
Okay.
I am saying
This was copied and pasted from Jeff.
I am saying it is remarkable how little typographical errors there may be.
Yeah.
But yes, we will definitely sort those out and appreciate you bringing them to our attention.
Yeah, and I like the idea of putting a space in there, care of Shania's recommendation. I have one other small recommendation. I'm wondering if when we mention things like the waterfront communities or other communities, I guess, would it be possible to, in the context of these paragraphs, bold the specific community names so they're more easily found within the context of the paragraph? A thought. Or underline or italics or whatever. Just
Sorry, in the definition section only, or are you talking about?
I'm thinking
in the
maybe
zoning
even throughout where we've got specific communities itemized so that people can easily see
Bold them. Yep. So we'll make
12 Mile Bay, Cognition.
Yeah, or even inland, whatever. Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's the last interruption from Councillor Jarvis. He's going to send all the rest of his comments forward. Thank you. Just very briefly on this particular subject, I wouldn't mind having a turn, but just simply to say I would like to get out of Councillor Bochek's basement, but since I'm down there, I thought because there's no visual impact, I think the parking issue is relevant, but the rest of it, if there's a full basement underground, there could be habitable spaces, so that could have an impact. But I understand what you're driving at here. Most of this is non-waterfront, or all of it is non-waterfront, so I sort of get that. But I think we need to keep remembering that any intensification does impact our environment. So I'm making a sort of an environmental plea as opposed to a planning and wording plea. Thank you.
Okay, and our last slide.
I have one final observation. If Councillor Cooper will allow it, or Mayor Cooper, or stand-in Mayor.
No, none.
The real mayor will allow it.
Really quickly, if we go back to the previous slide, we talked about the fact that it does not apply to sure SR zones, correct?
Zones.
Okay, it's kind of weird because item number 2 under gross floor area, you're talking about waterfront communities, and basically they're all SR zone, are they not?
Yes, but they're specific. So again, 1 and 2 were meant to simply be the first definition of gross floor area that is currently in the zoning bylaw is number 1, which applies generally to the SR and SRI zones.
Okay.
And number 2 is specific to Cognizine, Wawatisi, Go Home Bay. I think I said Wawa.
Just the waterfront, those waterfront communities, correct?
Yeah, just those 3. And
Which
so,
implies SR zone.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, fine. Okay, that's all.
So the first two definitions apply to the SR and SRI zones. So the last definitions change that we wanted to bring to your attention is the definition of yard. And this was required for a few reasons. It was required, number 1, because of the OBRM zone, and we've integrated a reference there, as you can see, to the OBRM definition. But also it was required because there was some confusion in the way the previous wording was written as to where, with our lack of straight front lot lines, as is often the case on water's edge properties, where this measurement was actually made. And what was less than clear in the previous definitions, we believe we've now clarified, whereas previously it was required that the director of planning make an interpretation. We were now making it clear that the shortest point between a front lot line and a front wall is that distance for the minimum required yard. And so, or for the yard. And so the idea is that even though you might have an instance where you've got a measurement of, I don't know, 23 meters in one location and 20 meters in another location, it's 20 meters, not 23. And so we've tried to clarify that, and we hope that it meets with your support.
When you said the front wall,
Is somebody speaking?
sorry, Mayor. My question was, it was stated that the front yard setback was from the high water mark to the front wall of the building. And my question would be, why isn't it anything that infringes in that area, like a 12-foot wide deck or a 14-foot wide deck? Wouldn't that be the infringement onto that front yard setback?
No, the way in which our zoning bylaw currently works and will work after the housekeeping amendment is that a deck that goes into the minimum required yard, whether it's a front yard or a side yard or a rear yard, is a projection from the dwelling in question. And so it is allowed to project a certain distance into that yard, but if someone wants to project further into that yard, then they may be required to seek a minor variance or request a site-specific zoning bylaw amendment. I think one of the key things that maybe we left out of our presentation that is important in helping to answer your question is that we have changed in our zoning bylaw in the proposed version that is being house kept, the way in which we are measuring setbacks from the water's edge. We used to have multiple setbacks from the water's edge, and we've essentially clarified that second 20 meters, so we were oftentimes changing not only the minimum required yard, but we were changing the minimum required setback from a water body or water course, which I think was in section 4.42 or something of that nature. We interpreted that to mean that there were water bodies and water courses that may not be associated with a yard requirement. They may be small, creeks, whatever, but that there was still a need for a setback from those. And so that setback from another kind of water body or water course is no longer duplicating a minimum front yard in a shoreline residential dwelling, for example. But it may now actually apply to a rural dwelling or property, or to even an R-zoned property, if there were a small nearby creek, which previously wasn't associated with a minimum yard requirement. And in fact, it might flow across the property, it might be on a neighbor's property, only part of that setback might be on a property or lot. And so that is one other important change that we are proposing to the housekeeping bylaw that I don't think we had a slide for, that is in section 4.
It wasn't removed, it was relocated. And I guess I could pull it up.
Okay, I'm satisfied with what you've told us, but in the past, and I'm going to use an example here, and on 6 Mile Lake, you have a cottage that has a deck off the front of it, comes down to a deck that comes off the front of it, down some stairways to a deck, to a huge deck that is now right on the waterfront. And there was a neighbor complaint, you can look it up, Judy Kirk, and she was made to remove that because it was in the front yard setback. Now you're telling me that it's from the high water mark to the front wall of the building. I'm confused.
Well,
Yeah, sir, if it would help counsel, so it's a common approach in municipal zoning bylaws to take the front yard to the wall. But then as Jeff has indicated, there's a maximum permitted projection for certain types of structures as decks. Maybe it's 5 meters, maybe if you go any closer than that maximum permitted projection, then you're into a variance.
Okay, I just don't understand things very well.
Yep.
That's all.
And additionally, and I'm not familiar with the specific enforcement that took place, but additionally, so we do in the existing bylaw and in the proposed bylaw have something called a freestanding deck. So you have attached decks which project from buildings, and then in the shoreline residential zones, there is an accessory building or structure that can be a freestanding deck. And freestanding decks can be as close as 0 meters from the front lot line. However, there's a maximum size, and it's, I believe, 40 square meters, Shania? There's a maximum size of freestanding decks, and I suspect by what you were describing that there were a number of freestanding decks that probably exceeded the maximum size of the freestanding decks.
Okay, so we can't tighten anything up here. That'll be at the time when we review the whole thing. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay, so that concludes us going through.
Well, can we go back a couple pages?
So we've attempted to go through all of the proposed changes through housekeeping within the scope of housekeeping. But it is difficult for us to show all the changes in one presentation. So we do encourage council to look at the housekeeping bylaw versus the consolidation that's on our website. Keep in mind that you may be looking at the consolidation that says 4.15 is this section, and now you're trying to find in the housekeeping, it may be relocated. But nothing was removed. There was no change in actual requirements. Anyways, what's next is we would like to have a public open house on April 4th, I believe at 5 p.m. It'll be hybrid, so people can attend virtually and in person. And then, assuming all goes well, we have received comments, we make changes for the public meeting on May 6th. And that's
My
all.
comments there, we've got to figure out how to make these public meetings get the information out to as many people as possible. In this day and age, it seems kind of confusing as the best way to do that. But I think, as Councillor Cooper has noted, a lot of people in the waterfront community will not be present here physically until probably June or July, but being able to present remotely is a great idea, and I think people will probably be taking that in so long as they're aware of it, and that's the part we've got to get right, is making sure information gets out to everybody. And I don't even know I don't know how to do that.
Sure. Digital signboard we have out at the corner.
Yeah, that may be the best way. I don't know. Anyway, some way of getting it out to everybody so they know. That's important.
So our current thoughts right now on that are to both have a public notice that's on the screen in the front, a notice on the website. So as soon as you would land on the website, it would tell you that there's something coming up. You could click on it and then open up the full notice. We've already set up a spot on the website for all of the documents that have previously been in your agendas, which we would then put in a one location place for the public to go to. The notice would actually include that. The notice would be sent out to our full list of community groups and associations. We will be providing it to the landowners that are directly affected, such as Oak Bay. And we're Council Connect. It's going to be included there. Certainly we can share the notice with each of you, and if you can share it with as many, I think it's spread the word, and maybe we'll even add that to the notice. Please feel free to share with your neighbors something along those lines, because we do want people to participate. The public open house itself is going to be both in person and online. So we will be here, and any of you who wish to be here are welcome to join us. It's going to start at 5 p.m. on April 4th. So our hope is that people are finished work, and if they're local, they can attend. If they're further away and they want to participate, they can attend online. Karen has kindly offered to be here and provide her excellent services as a resource. And again, we are going to be giving a very similar presentation to the one we've given you, with small changes that we'll make, such as correcting those typos, to make sure things are done. I think what's really important, though, as we sum up, is we are asking for you to pass a resolution. And this resolution doesn't say that you're yet supporting this amendment. So that will come to you at the public meeting on May 6th. But what it does is it says, yeah, this is ready for the public. And so I think what's important as you now contemplate and maybe have a discussion amongst yourselves is, are we ready for prime time? And if you feel that we are, we look forward to having that public open house on April 4th.
A quick question is, generally we do a tour in the spring. We go up to Go Home Lake, we go up to we go everywhere to the AGMs. Would our planning department be available to attend those AGMs and try and explain some of this to the groups? Because a lot of people aren't going to be able to make it to Baxter Ward Community Center or here. But at the AGMs, usually I get up and talk, or Peter gets up and talk, and tries to fill in everybody on what's been going on with the township. The mayor does a great job on it, say up at Go Home. So this is so complex, and I don't think The layman, like myself, should be standing up in front of a cottage association trying to explain what we're doing in planning. I'd make a mess out of it. But you could be there to answer questions from our constituents, and I think it would be of value if planning would supply somebody like that.
Absolutely. The one thing I think at that point, though, is the housekeeping amendment would have already been enacted in all likelihood. And so we're happy to give outreach and information, but I think we still want to encourage people as much as they can, if they have any interests, to participate in the open house and in the public meeting. Because other than the few landowners that we're going to reach out directly to where we're actually doing some changes, in most cases, again, we're simply trying to communicate the same information in a different way. We hope it's better. We hope actually that it reduces the questions people might have. But that's our take on it. And if somebody had a strong take otherwise, their chance to speak would be on April 4th or on May 6th.
Great, thank you.
Would May?
Could we please stop sharing the screen? All right, so let's see if we can get some final comments on this. If anybody wants to make any final comments. I know I do.
Yes, I was just about to do that.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm sympathetic with what has been said by Councillor Bochek, but I understand where you're coming from. That this is really taking this document and making it more clear. It's not really fundamentally changing very much. Where we really want the feedback, I think, from our community is when we go with the official plan amendments and zoning bylaw amendments. That's where there's some real meat, so to speak. Not that this isn't important, because it is. Clarity of communication is important. However, it's a nice suggestion, I think, if you guys would be willing to attend a few cottage association meetings. They might even throw a picnic in there for you as well. You never know if you're really good. Anyway, I'm serious about that, by the way. So I would encourage that if you're willing to do it. I think it might sit very well with those communities, and you'd be far better qualified to answer questions than I would be, for example. I'm sure other councillors may know a lot more than I, but I'd certainly encourage that. The other thing I'd say in terms of communicating this, you know, having it on our website and social media and so on is lovely. A lot of our community are not particularly interested in either the website or social media, and so I would encourage that rather than trying to work with the pull, we're really push in terms of communication would be more productive. And with that in mind, it's getting it out to maybe the president of all the cottage associations and their communications people. And I think you can get all that information, if you don't have it, from our sustainability department. And I would encourage that, because that really will get the messages out to people. And let's get you invited to those AGMs. It's not that many. It might be, you know, 4 or 5, something like that, and it might take half a day or something. But could be kind of cool for you to, you know, get to see some of these communities that you may have seen from a planning perspective, but not from a community perspective. So I would encourage that. Director Whitlib, is that a possibility?
Speaking for myself, that was certainly always my intention.
No, sorry, you can't come.
You had me at picnic.
Just kidding. Thank you.
Councillor Predko.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor, I guess we'll go back to more formal now that we're back in the picture. Very quickly, I think you guys have done a great job of trying to organize and make this a good stepping stone for the larger project. And my only suggestions on communications is perhaps the people who have open applications may be interested in changing definitions and changing wording, just in case that affects their application. And the insert for the tax bill. That would be all I have to offer. But anyways, good job. Thank you.
All right, I kind of a little bit echo what we've just heard, but I think that as I've said before, I'm very impressed with all this. But I also think we have to remember that this is housekeeping. And none of what is presented in front of us should really change any of the rights or privileges of our residents with regards to their property. Because that's a whole separate kettle of fish. I also would think that I'm willing to bet that 99+% of our residents will be bored to tears with a report on housekeeping. So if that means 1%, which is 180 people roughly, might be interested. So we have to make sure those 180 people, and I'm just making up that number as we go along, that they get a copy of this. And I imagine some of them have actually will or will review this YouTube to see some of the comments made. But I don't think we need to get out in front of the public at annual meetings or informal meetings for the average membership, because I don't think they'll be that concerned with housekeeping. But I love the idea of our planning department getting out in front of as many groups, associations, what have you, this year, saying this is what we're doing with our zoning official plan and zoning bylaw review. These are the things that are in front of us. If you have any ideas, have any input, please pay attention, and etc. I think that is extremely important. I'm fully in agreement with the current timeline with all this, because I think we need to get this housekeeping behind us. I do sincerely believe it's going to make our official plan and zoning bylaw review that much easier when we have a clearer representation of what 2014 bylaw actually said, and including discovering some surprises in it that should probably be corrected in our new zoning bylaw. I remember many years ago when we first started talking about doing an official plan and zoning bylaw review, the general consensus was mostly we need I'll call it an update versus a replacement. And I think that's still the case, is that most of what we're not going to make radical changes to 2014. We're just going to try to improve it and make it clearer. And I think this housekeeping is a significant step in that direction. So that's some of my thoughts. Director Whitliff, you wanted to add something?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to echo those comments, and I appreciate them. And certainly, as I've indicated earlier to this council, one of the aspects of the official plan and zoning bylaw review that this housekeeping update has illustrated for staff is our capacity, we believe, to do the zoning bylaw part of the comprehensive review of the zoning bylaw part in-house. We'll still need outside assistance with respect to the official plan review. There's some heavy lifting there that would take away from our capacity to provide development services to our community. But the zoning bylaw component, this process that Shania and Jeff have undertaken has clearly illustrated that we have the capacity in-house to fix and update that component, being the zoning bylaw.
If I can add to that, I think we have a fully staffed, very skilled planning department, and how wonderful that is for all of us compared to many of the years in the past. So I think that's a terrific thing, that a lot of this can be done in-house with people who know our area more than the outside consultants. Councillor Cooper.
Just echoing what you said, Mayor. I maybe wasn't terribly clear. I don't see you coming out to the cottage associations and going through each one of these pages by any means. It's more of an opportunity, a sales pitch, so to speak, of our planning department and who we are and what we are. That would be terrific. And sure, there might be the odd question if we share this document with our communities. There might be some questions. I know in my community there's a lot of interest in planning, because we do realize that intensification will impact the environment, and not that this cleanup is going to make any difference necessarily, other than clarity, but I think the community is interested very much in how planning can impact our environment. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to read the motion. They have moved by Councillor Bocek, seconded by Councillor Predko. Be it resolved that council receive the report regarding housekeeping for the comprehensive zoning bylaw 2014-75 or housekeeping, that council provide comments that they may wish to make regarding housekeeping. We did that for more than 2 hours. And that staff be directed to schedule an open house for public consultation on the housekeeping on April 4th, 2025. All those in favor? And that is carried. Thank you. Now we have one more item to discuss, but it's also now 12:35. I don't know if we want to go for a lunch break before we get into our final staff report on an OLT review, or if you want to soldier on, and hopefully the conversation on that item would be somewhat limited so the hunger pangs don't get too loud. Council, which way do you want to go?
I'd like to get it done.
Okay. All right, let's get this done. And if it goes on past 1 o'clock, well, then we'll berate each other. I don't know. All right. So we have a OLT review appeal rather pending. And Mr. Donaldson, you're going to provide some input on this, please.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. The report in front of you today comes as the property owners of 182 Wild Rice Trail have appealed council's decision regarding their zoning bylaw amendment file Z2413. Prior to presenting the options, I can provide a brief history of the application to date. Plan Muskoka, on behalf of the owner Kayla Thompson, submitted a zoning bylaw amendment in October 2024. The application was then brought before Planning Council for a public meeting on November 5th, 2024, for the purpose of conveying information and gathering comments. The applicant made the choice to defer the application at the December 10th, 2024 Planning Council meeting to consider the correspondence received in objection to the application. In response to the correspondence received, the applicant reduced the gross floor area and width of the proposed dwelling, reduced the projection of the proposed dock and boathouse, and reduced the lot coverage to attempt to address the neighbors' concerns. The revised application was then brought back to the February 4th, 2025 Planning Council meeting and was defeated by council. Staff are now looking for direction on how council intends to proceed. In accordance with the timelines under the Planning Act, the appeal package must be sent to the tribunal no later than tomorrow, March 5th, 2025. There are two options for council to consider. One being that the township retain a solicitor and a planner to represent the municipality, as township planning staff have recommended approval of the application and cannot represent the township in the appeal hearing. And option two being that council provide no representation to uphold their decision at the OLT. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Director Whitlow.
Just one point of clarification, just so council is not under the impression that they're under the gun to make a decision in reference to the appeal package deadline that Mr. Donaldson just mentioned. The appeal package being the record, the file has been sent to the OLT. We've met that obligation. So there's no decision that needs to be made today that we require to inform the OLT of. Just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that.
All right, so we've met the deadline. So our choice in front of us is we can decide at this point to say we're not going to provide representation at the hearing, or two, that we would like to involve a solicitor to advise us on how best to go forward with whatever whatever response we might decide to file. Councilor Predko.
Just to clarify, option one is with solicitor support and option two is without and with no representation.
Yep. So option two is to decide now that we're not going to have representation. Option one is for us to get further advice on how we might respond.
Yes, thank you.
Councilor Cooper.
I'm not sure these questions can be answered, but one is that if we walk away from this, essentially we're setting
in a way, a precedence, which is a consideration, that essentially says some of our bylaws aren't working very well in this particular area. Secondly, is there a way with our official plan review and zoning bylaw review that we can get some wording into our official plan that would reduce the risk of having this happen again? So that's for planning to maybe respond to. Thank you.
Through the mayor to council. So the policy framework under which this application was considered was the recent amendment 22 to the official plan, which was the 6 Mile Lake policy. So that's a very recent policy that council weighed in on and approved. So I'm not sure what other direction, but certainly as part of the official plan review, all of the official plan is open to being revisited, all the community policies, including 6 Mile Lake. I just want to make it aware, remind council though that the 6 Mile Lake policies were recently reviewed and updated.
Any further comments? Councillor Jarvis.
Yeah, of course, I wasn't here for the February meeting. I'm a little lost because in our report highlights today, it talks about planning council having some concerns about lack of information, but in the minutes, I don't see what that lack of information is. So I'm a little lost on that aspect of it. Also, just based on experience, our current experience with the OLT tends to be that the OLT will side with the applicant and not with us, which is a cautionary comment and nothing else. So that would be my concern is we're going before the OLT. If we want to hire a bunch of people to defend our position, it may all be for naught based on the way the OLT tends to lean decision-wise, and I'm concerned in that regard. We're trying to cut back on legal costs, and I think we'd just be burdening ourselves with more costs that will go for naught if we pursue this at the OLT. Thank you.
Thank you. Not seeing any other comments, I'll make my comment, and that is what I find myself favoring option 1 simply because I think that gives us a chance to review the file, and that still allows us to decide down the road that we're actually going to go for option 2. Option 2 means we're making a decision right now. We're not going to provide representation at the OLT hearing. Option 1 says let's gather some more information before we make a decision of if and or how we're going to represent ourselves at that hearing. Councillor Bochek.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. Like Councillor Jarvis, our history is not great at the OLT, and I'm leaning towards option number 2. With the provincial government, the Ford government saying build more homes faster, he doesn't seem to be able to differentiate between something in Hamilton and something in Muskoka. It's all thrown under one big blanket. So when they say build more homes faster, they don't care if it's on Little Lake or in Stony Creek. They could care less. So I don't think we need to represent ourselves. We have the ability to put forth the facts. If the OLT rules against us, they rule against us. They're going to do it either way, with a lawyer or without. Thank you.
Any other comments? Councillor Jarvis, followed by Councillor Cooper.
Sorry, did I understand you correctly, Mr. Mayor, in suggesting that with option 1, we still have the possibility of changing our mind and going with option 2 after talking with council on this? Does that make?
My interpretation, option 1 gives us the opportunity to talk with a solicitor as to how we would move forward to represent ourselves, and we can also, with that solicitor, discuss what we think the odds are. and that sort of thing. And the solicitor may advise us not to represent ourselves. We've had that, for instance, in the past. And the difficulty for me with this being put in front of us right now is, while it's perfectly factual, we have not sought or not received a legal opinion yet on this file.
Correct. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate your clarification.
Councillor Cooper.
I'm sort of leaning in that direction, option one as well, to get more clarification. And I would welcome some sort of conference with our lawyer by Zoom to have some discussion around this, because there are other reasons that we've been losing at the OLT, and let's get those out on the table. And if we can't win, we're probably banging our heads against the wall under the current circumstance that we find ourselves. Part of it's there are a number of different reasons, which I'm not going to get into here, but I'd support option one for the time being. It's really a conference call with the lawyers, maybe a half an hour or an hour discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Director Whitlibb and then Councillor Predko.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just under the circumstances, given the discussion, perhaps there should have been a third option also presented to council, and that is you could defer making a decision pending, should council seek some advice, legal advice, then return to the matter. And that might assist in not giving a wrong impression in terms of any decision that might be made today.
Yeah, because I appreciate that advice, because picking option one was, in a sense, deferring the decision until we got more information, which is the same thing as deferring the decision until we get more information. So, Councillor Predko.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor, I was going to comment from my reading of option one. It seems to be much more directional in terms of hiring council to represent us, and staff would not be involved in the application. So I was wondering if there was a third option, such as deferral or referral, so that we could seek some advice before we make a decision as to whether we want to be represented or not. Thank you.
I would certainly be in favor of a deferral myself. Anybody else wish to comment? Councillor Bochek?
Just a question of clarity. In the last terms, and perhaps Councillor Cooper can help me with this, but in the last terms of council, the mayor, before Mayor Coetzee, with our previous mayor, took the stance at the OLT of no opinion. I think you probably remember that. And when we were challenged in going to the OLT, it was agreed upon by council, we didn't have an opinion. Let the data take care of itself, let things support themselves, and we will abide by what the OLT says. That's something that happened quite a bit in my first term, where we had no opinion. Perhaps you can tell me, Director Whitlibb, what the ramifications are going into a hearing with that particular attitude.
Director Whitlibb.
Thank you. Through the mayor. So in that type of scenario where a party does not present a case, and speaking to the current circumstance, should council choose not to send representation, in terms of OLT procedure and expectations, it would likely be appropriate that staff appear at the start of the hearing and avail themselves as a resource to the OLT should the OLT have factual questions on when was the application received, what is the land designated or zoned, that sort of thing, but not providing any planning evidence. In terms of the scenario that Councillor Bochek mentioned, likely what would happen, the OLT, having heard only planning evidence from the appellant and their planner, and having heard no contradictory evidence, unless that evidence presented was incredibly flawed, the OLT would simply concur with the incontroverted opinion
of the evidence that they've been provided. So having no opinion simply hands the case over to the other side, so to speak.
If I may, Mayor?
Please.
I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing here. There was a period of about 3 years where we had virtually no OLT. If that's the period you're referring to, it wasn't a no opinion, it was no recommendation. No planning recommendations were given during that period. Planning department was instructed to offer 3 options but no recommendations. And we ended up for a 3-year period with virtually no OLT problems. That's what I think you're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, seeing no more hands and sensing a, will council be acceptable if I read a motion for deferral, and we'll see how much, whether it carries? So I moved by Councillor Jarvis, second by Councillor Cooper, where zoning bylaw amendment file Z24-13 was denied by council on February 4th, 2025. And where zoning bylaw amendment file Z24-13 was appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal, the OLT. Now therefore be it resolved that council directs staff to proceed with option 1 as option either as outlined in report 2025-031 regarding Z24-13. All those in favor of a deferral? Yes, please.
Just in terms of the process, I think it's important for us to talk about that there'll be some discussion with council by council, so to speak. That's not really in this resolution. I'm all for a deferral, but that there's going to be a Zoom meeting with council and legal counsel.
Clerk Way.
I am also confused about what you read out loud to capture.
Sorry?
I also don't really have a clear understanding of what it was that you said out loud to capture it in the record. So you're saying that council directs staff to proceed with option 1 as outlined in the report?
Well, does it matter which option I put in if we're going for deferral?
Well, then I think it would be better if, and that council defer the decision.
Okay.
Report.
All right, so then the first 2 sentences stand, the 2 whereases, and then I'll say, now therefore be it resolved that council defer their decision on this matter, or whatever wording you like.
Until
legal advice.
Until legal advice is considered.
Legal counsel.
Which I presume would mean that this would be put on our next closed agenda as it involves legal advice. All right. Do you need me to read something more before I call the vote? Or is it clear? So I'm going to say all those in favor of a deferral of this matter. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is carried. Thank you. All right. Now we're going to close. Oh, we got a confirming bylaw. Yes, here we go. Moved by Councillor Bocek, seconded by Councillor Cooper. Be it resolved that Planning Council adopt bylaw 2025-025, I believe.
Correct, yes.
025 to confirm the proceedings of the March 4th, 2025 Planning Council meeting. All those in favor? And that is carried. And then moved by Councillor Petco, seconded by Councillor Jarvis. Be it resolved that Planning Council does now adjourn at 12:53 p.m. until April 8th, 2025 at 9 a.m. or at the call of the chair. All those in favor? And that is carried. We are adjourned. Now, I think we need a lunch break before we get into Committee of the Whole. Is 1:30 too soon, or do you prefer 1:45? I'm not hearing any opinions.
I hear 1:30.
Okay, let's do it. We'll do council of the whole as a 1:30. Thank you very much, everyone.